Okay, everyone. So nice to meet all of you. Let me just introduce myself a little bit. My name is Matthew Kyle, and I hold a PhD in classics, that is Greek and Latin languages, culture, history, and I teach Latin that my main job, my day job, is as a Latin teacher in a high school in New York City, Francis Lewis High School, where I've taught now actually for 20 years. Hard to believe, even for myself, that it's been so long. But for the last 6 years, I've also taught classics at Fordham, and I've taught in colleges elsewhere besides that as well. So our course together is in some ways one of the most foundational classes I think that you will take in your college career, because Roman history is really so fundamental in so many ways to our modern world. It may not seem that. Certainly, I'm sure if you've told people that you're studying Roman history over the summer, you may have gotten the same reaction that I often get when I tell them that I tell people that I teach Latin or I teach Roman history. They would say, you know, why bother? Why bother studying the history of an ancient society that flourished so many thousands of years ago? And that's a good question. So I would like to answer that question right now. And just kind of by way of introduction, I also would like to set out the sort of parameters for our course together, the limits of our study in terms of time, the thematic, chronological, and geographic focuses for our course. And then I want to add some kind of personal thoughts, specifically to the nature of ancient history and how it differs from what we might consider kind of typical history of more modern periods, okay, because there are some significant differences there. And indeed, that is actually one of the questions that you will have to be writing about for next week. So first of all, let's get to that opening question. Why study ancient Rome at all? As I said, I am often asked that question. And in fact, very recently it happened. Someone said, what do you do? And I said, I teach Latin and Roman history. And why? Well, I can't really just say, well, it's because it pays so well. Nobody would believe that. But why specifically ancient Rome? And I believe the answer to that is quite complicated. And in some ways it's personal. Everybody perhaps will have their own predilections, their own reasons for studying the classics. Different people will give you different answers. And I think the overwhelming reason is that Rome has exerted a continuous and profound influence on the history, not just of Europe, but of the entire Western world, our entire Western civilization. And also because of the dominance of the Western world in the global forum. Rome, through that, has exerted an influence over the entire span of the world and of world history. The heritage of Rome is vast. And I'll give you just one sort of example from the tessera, one tessera from the complicated mosaic of the heritage of the West that has been transferred to us. I'll just give you one little snippet of that. And that is something known as the Grand Tour, which was popular from, say, the time of the Renaissance, right down through to the 19th century. And it was popular amongst British noble youths, especially noblemen, in the 18th century. And the Grand Tour was what they call, was kind of like a prerequisite for the educated man who had already read his Latin and Greek in school and perhaps in the universities. And what the Grand Tour was it involved traveling over to the continent from England, usually beginning in Paris. And then with most people who were doing this, it involved an itinerary moving through the great cultural centers of Europe, but the destination was invariably Rome. And you could, of course, add on Florence and Naples and other places. In the 18th century, the city of Pompeii had just been discovered and was being excavated at first in a very sort of desultory and almost treasure hunting kind of way, but more systematically later on. So as I said, Naples was also a popular destination. But, and there were others as well. But the ultimate destination was invariably Rome. At any one time, there could be hundreds of Englishmen traversing the continent on their way to looking at all the ancient monuments. In 1786, for instance, Sir John Fleming Lester noted that Rome was, quote, perfectly filled with Englishmen. And Edward Gibbon, who wrote this monumental work of English literature, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, his vast and magisterial study of the last several hundred years of the Roman Empire. While he was, he got the idea for this monumental work while sitting on the Capitoline Hill in Rome, on the Grand Tour himself as a young man in the year 1764. Now, the direct way that the ancient world came into the modern through these grand tours is in some ways self-evident. When these young men came back from Italy and Rome, they brought with them the sensibilities of the ancient world. They liked to decorate their houses, for instance, or even build them in neoclassical styles. This, for instance, is the Frick Museum that hopefully you've had a chance to visit in your time at Fordham, but if you haven't, please do so. It's, I believe it's on 79th Street and Park Avenue, one of the most beautiful museums in New York, but also specifically, it's beautiful because it gives the perfect illustration of what the Roman house or Roman domus would have looked like with this inner courtyard and everything that you see in front of you. It was built entirely in a neoclassical style. And all these people that I'm referring to, they all like to surround themselves either with genuine artifacts or with fakes. In the poetry they wrote, the literature they wrote, they reproduced ancient Roman sensibilities. In fact, the very word romantic, the reason why it has the word Rome at the front of it comes from the same cultural influence. And it all is really an illustration of the direct cultural influence from the Grand Tour. And as I said, that's only one tiny tessera in the grand mosaic of Western civilization. But if we look to the modern world around us, the face of Rome is everywhere to be seen, as long as you know how to look for it and how to identify it when you see it. First of all, the Romans have given us two major models of government: a balanced republic using a limited and enfranchised body of citizens who elect members of a council that has an executive branch of officers answerable to that council and who carry out the orders of that council. That is a Roman model of government. And if it sounds familiar to us, it's because our own founding fathers they looked directly to the Roman exemplar when crafting their own form of government. Now, the other model, which is not so popular, especially on this side of the Atlantic, but which has been very popular in Europe over the centuries and is still around in certain places, is a monarchy. But it is a monarchy that is sanctioned and tempered by law and tradition. A monarchy answerable to councils, to parliaments, and to the public. And of course, a final form of government that has died out since, but was very popular and common in Europe for many centuries, was absolute monarchy. But that indeed also has a Roman exemplar to it. Now, in the case of the United States, the founders, as I mentioned, were unequivocally and directly influenced by their knowledge of the ancient Roman past in formulating the Constitution. There have been plenty of books that bring this out very clearly if you're interested in that sort of thing. One was published in 1995 called The Founders and the Classics, and it's a really great read to see how Thomas Jefferson and so many of our founding fathers were so heavily influenced by the model of Rome. But it is not just the polity of the USA that has been influenced by ancient Rome. But also, indeed, starting with the founding fathers again, it was their attitudes towards agriculture, pastoralism, the place of the citizen in the state. All of these were all informed by the founders' knowledge of the classics, and particularly the Roman classics. Going further, another feature of the Roman world that we inherited and which we take for granted is our reverence for the law. The Romans simply loved the law. They conceived of the law as this totalizing force in the universe, perhaps somewhat differently from the way we do. It wasn't the law of individual human rights, the way our modern law is, but nevertheless, the notion that law stands above us all, that the law is something to which all of us, even the most powerful, are answerable, including the members of our government. That is a Roman concept. The Romans were also very profligate by ancient standards with their citizenship. In fact, if you study ancient history, for instance, if you study ancient Greek history, which just as a small plug, I also teach at Fordham in the fall and in the spring. If you're interested in studying that, but you'll see that if you study ancient Greece, that ancient Greek city-states were not at all interested in giving away their citizenship to people that were not born amongst them. In fact, most states throughout history, including right on up until our own day, are very, very zealous to guard their own citizenship and don't allow many people who are not born among them to become citizens. Rome was very different in this regard. Rome, almost uniquely in world history up until America, was a place where essentially anybody, given enough time and given the right circumstances, could ultimately become a citizen. The only other country in the world history that has been so open about giving away their citizenship is America, and of course, we far outstrip any other nation in the whole world in terms of the people that we naturalize every year. Something like 1 million people every year we naturalize as full legal citizens. And if you want to go further with that, the very notion of a kind of universal citizenship is a Roman notion. So we could say, in all fairness, that the very notion of the West, so many things that we take for granted, law, citizenship rights, are all founded on a memory of ancient Rome. Europe has almost always seen, until the 20th century, some form of what usually was called the Holy Roman Empire. Although in Voltaire's famous quip, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but that's not really the point. The idea that people could somehow call a political entity in Europe a Roman Empire shows the power of the memory of Rome, which I think arguably stands at the foundation of our concept of the West as a cultural and political entity. In more everyday ways, we see Rome around us all the time, in our art, in our architecture, especially large public buildings. I've put this image on the screen now of the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. And of course, the Capitol building, the Capitol building in Washington comes immediately to mind. This is a Roman building. Some people may think it's Greek, but they are ignorant that the Greek style of building actually is quite different. This is clearly Roman. The Greeks didn't have domes, first of all. Romans were the ones who developed concrete, and so they were able to develop curvilinear forms of architecture, which were often encased in Greek classical forms like columns and marble and so forth, but the dome itself is a Roman invention. But nevertheless, it all goes under the name neoclassical, but very much it is really a Roman model in public architecture. If you look at ancient Roman temples and compare them again to the Supreme Court building, you'll see that the influence is very palpable. The Supreme Court building is clearly a model on the Greek temple. I'm sorry, the Roman temple. And if you want to go a little bit further, see, this is what a Greek temple would look like. This is the Lincoln Memorial. See, a Greek temple, we'll get into this later on, but it has a different style. You can approach it from all sides. It has a few steps going up, which can be approached from all sides, and columns going around the whole outside. So here's an example from the Italian city of Paestum in the south of Italy. And you can see that is a Greek style. Even it's on Italy, it's on Italian soil, but nevertheless it is a Greek style. But that is to be totally contrasted with the let's say the Roman model here. This is from France, but it's the same style. See, the Roman style had a big front and quite a few steps going up, and then a small set of columns right at the beginning with only one entrance at the top. If we just take another rather specific form of Roman building, the triumphal arch. This is something that usually an emperor, but it could be in different times generals as well, returning in triumph from some military conquest. This one is the Arch of Constantine in Rome. And these emperors or generals would erect one of these things to their own glory. But of course, if you go to France, this is what you'll see, Napoleon's famous Arc de Triomphe in the L'Étoile. In general, this is just one form of architecture, but you could go on and on about the same things for painting, sculpture, all these other art forms that have been governed, or at least been greatly exercised by an influence of Roman achievement, okay, Roman art and cultural achievement. And there's many other things we can say, but that's just a small little sampling. It's kind of scratching the surface. And there's many other things that we could talk about from the ancient world, specifically from ancient Rome. But then there are other reasons why studying ancient Roman history is so important and so worthwhile. There is no doubt that in the popular image, for instance, there are certain powerful themes, images in the mind that can spring up when one thinks of ancient Rome, and that still resonate with us now. You might, when you think of Rome, what comes to mind? People in togas getting stabbed like Caesar in the Senate House, Nero fiddling while Rome burned, gladiators fighting to the death on the sands of the arena in front of ravening crowds, perhaps chariot races, decadent Caligula palace, kind of, wild parties, or whatever the case may be. These are all popular images that come to mind of ancient Rome, and they are certainly to be found reproduced in popular culture again and again. And why is that? Why is it that we still find a culture from so many thousands of years ago still so captivating? Well, because there is this human element to it that goes beyond even anything intellectual, but just simply the fact that these were really colorful human beings who had emotions like we do, who experienced love and senses of betrayal and revenge and all the gamut of the human experience. And yet they were capable of portraying these things both in their own lives and in their literature in such colorful and enduring ways that we still find them captivating thousands of years later. And then perhaps if I just might add that there is a more mundane reason for studying Roman history, and that is simply it's just really interesting. The Roman Empire, for instance, was so large. It stretched from Syria to Scotland, from the Black Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. That's 3 different continents that it spanned. Not, of course, the entirety of Asia and Africa by any means, or even of Europe, for that matter. But nevertheless, it did span those 3 continents. And it was extremely long-lived as empires go, 700 years, which is quite a remarkable achievement, especially look at the European Union right now, trying to have one currency, one kind of bureaucratic structure, regulating all these different nations of people. They can't really seem to do it very well, but Rome did it for all those hundreds and hundreds of years. A really remarkable achievement, how that empire survived for so long. And what is more, during that long period, over the great expanse of that territory, the Roman political system changed enormously and yet still thrived. And what I mean by that is that unlike many other ancient states, which tended to be fairly static, the Roman Empire changed dramatically, both socially, politically, culturally, again and again. It reinvented itself, to use the modern term, repeatedly. It changed from being initially a monarchy to then becoming a democratic republic of representative democracy, and then back to a monarchy, and then ultimately to be initially a kind of constitutional monarchy, and then more to an openly autocratic, divinely legitimated monarchy on the model of the medieval monarchy. In fact, if you want to understand European history and the transition, to the Middle Ages, you have to understand late Roman history. Incidentally, and we'll be getting to that later on, that's actually the topic more for another class. Another class I'm teaching this summer, actually, which I do almost every semester, Pagans and Christians, which talks a lot about the late Roman Empire. But just that political process is fascinating to trace, the way that the Romans adapted and changed themselves to fit the new circumstances. Culturally, it changed from basically being a rustic, simple society of farmers and shepherds to being a highly sophisticated, urbanized, and a term that we will learn, Hellenized society, that is a society influenced by Greek culture. We will be looking at that in some detail later on in the course. So the long period of Rome's survival when coupled with the success of the empire and the way it changed over time, makes the study of ancient Rome a very interesting and fascinating subject in and of itself. So I hope that answers, at least to some degree, the question why. And I guess, again, I've advanced some personal reasons why I believe that the study of ancient Rome is so valuable and the study of ancient Rome is so fruitful. What I want to do is now is to sort of set the parameters for our course, to focus on what we will be looking at, and just as importantly, what we will not be looking at over the course of the coming lectures. Because when you do the history of any subject, especially one as vast as Rome, and we're going to be covering essentially 1,500 years of history here, there are so many things that could be looked at that we're going to have to cut and paste, if you like, and focus on certain things, unfortunately, to the detriment of others. That's inevitable. I do believe that the political and military history of Rome is the core of the subject, and therefore we will be looking at those categories in no uncertain way. We'll be focusing on the development of the Roman state along the lines that I've just mentioned, and we will be looking at the rise, maintenance, and eventually the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. We will also look to some degree at what can be broadly described as social, historical issues. What was Roman society like? What was it like to live there? What were the Roman social attitudes? What were their families like? Why did they have slaves? And what was the life of a slave like? What did they do for entertainment and relaxation? What were their religious beliefs like? The question, as I said before, of which is ultimately the most important historical development in all of European history. Why did Christianity emerge as the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, and under what circumstances did that happen? That really is a topic for another course, and I do teach that course, so we will not be looking at that much, maybe a little bit. But those are going to be the focuses, okay? What we will not be looking at, unfortunately, are the artistic and cultural matters in any great detail. I've talked here about Roman architecture and its influence on monumental, especially public architecture, civic architecture of the modern era. And that is something that we will, that you could take a whole class in. In fact, you could take multiple classes in that. Unfortunately, we will just not be able to look at that much. Whenever it comes up, I will show you pictures, though, of some famous Roman buildings, definitely. But it really is a subject for its own course, Roman art history, which Fordham offers. Likewise, and this is another thing to be regretted, but it is inevitable, we won't really have any time to look at literary matters, okay? The rise, development, and nature of Roman literature is worthy of getting a whole PhD in. Latin literature is one of the great literatures of all the world, but you know, so many monuments of beautiful poetry and plays and philosophy and letters and speeches, but unfortunately we will just not be able to look at that. It's just too much. But again, I will be drawing from those things, and on occasion, you know, I will definitely mention them, but we won't be looking at them in their own right. That is something we'll have to leave to the side. So in terms of chronological parameters, what are we going to say of chronological limits for the course? Technically, ancient Rome starts around 1000 BC. And if you really want to be technical about it, it didn't end until the year 1453 in the Byzantine Empire, when the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which survived the fall of the western half in the 5th century, lasted for another 1,000 years, and ultimately did not fall until 1453 to the Turks, when Constantinople fell to the Turks. So we are not going to cover all of that territory. It would simply be impossible. The main focus of our course will be up to the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, which is traditionally dated to the year 476 AD. But I will be even more specific. We will actually be focused on what is often called the central period of Roman history, the period that focuses from 300 BC to 300 AD, okay? 300 BC to 300 AD. And the reason why I'm setting those limits is that the study of late antiquity, as I've mentioned several times already, the period of the Christianized Roman Empire, is an immensely complicated one, and it is its own course in and of itself. In the view of many modern scholars, late antiquity really is the transitional point into medieval Europe. when so many of the social structures, especially the church, are going to be that are so dominant in the Middle Ages. That's really where everything kind of begins, is in late antiquity. So we're going to take the story down essentially to the cusp of that, but in those later centuries it'll be more kind of general. So our chronological limits will be roughly focusing on the period of 300 BC to 300 AD. And we will look at the early Roman period, and I will cover the issue of late antiquity and the fall of the Roman Empire, but I will do so in less detail than I will in the central core period of classical Roman history. Okay, so much for chronology. In geographical terms, we will follow the rise of the Roman Empire from a small hamlet, essentially, of shepherd huts overlooking the river Tiber in Italy, to a colossus that bestrode the then known civilized world. Our geographic parameters will basically be dictated by the activities of the Romans themselves, and as we're going to see, they were quite an energetic bunch. Wherever they go, that is where we will be going. So again, mostly Europe, but also into the Middle East and Northern Africa. Now, to kind of cap off these introductory remarks, I just would like to add some personal remarks, personal thoughts really on the nature of ancient history, and to introduce some themes, methods, and approaches of ancient historical research, which in the view of many differ significantly in ways from what most people consider typical history. That would be modern history. Okay, how is it that ancient history, the study of ancient history, differs so much from modern history? Well, let me put it like this. If one were to be guided by what history is, simply by looking at, say, the History Channel, you would be convinced that history is basically World War II. That, because history, every time you turn on the History Channel, it's always about Hitler. That's all there is about history. But of course, we might say in more general, it's all about recent events, okay? Modern history. And it's not hard to see why. Television requires moving pictures, and it is only in the more recent history, in the last 100 years, that we have moving pictures. So the study of modern history is one that has a very set quorum of methods to it. But ancient history, although it shares many of those methods with modern history, nevertheless has some significant differences. First of all, and I'll just make a sweeping generalization here. What is history? I would define history as in the following terms. History is, broadly speaking, a two-part process. It is the assemblage of facts about the past. That is one part, what happened. And then the second part is the interpretation of those facts. Okay? So what happened and an analysis of what happened. It is all good and well to know, for instance, that the battle on the Somme started on July 1st, 1916. But what is the meaning of this? What is the meaning of the Battle of the Somme? Why is it important? Why should we know that? What were the causes? Why should we look at it all? That is an interpretation of, that is a question of interpretation. Ancient history, of course, like modern history, in its broader outlines, takes the same approach. Okay, it also is about what happened and what is the interpretation of those facts. You assemble the facts and you try to analyze them. But the biggest difference between ancient history and the study of more recent periods is the problem of evidence. Okay, this is really a crucial point. And as I said, it's one of the things that you'll have, one of those 5 questions you have to write about for next week. So do listen carefully. I'm going to talk much more about this in a moment, but just to kind of introduce the idea. The issue of evidence, and I'm just going to introduce you to the problem and outline the sorts of limits that the problem of evidence places on our knowledge and the way ancient history is done. I'll do so by giving you an example. If you were to attempt to write a history of the US Congress as a single individual entity, in which you incorporated the development of the physical environment in which the Congress appeared, the Constitution of the Congress, every statute that was ever put out by the American Congress in its history, the relationship of the Congress to every president who has ever been sitting, the various influential individual congressmen and senators who have sat at one time or another in the US Congress, you would be facing an impossible task. The volume of material that you would have available to you would simply make it impossible for any one person to do that. But because in the ancient world, there is such a more limited body of material. It is not only possible to write a book with the title The Senate of Imperial Rome or The Magistrates of the Roman Republic, covering maybe 500 years of history in a single or two-volume work. The second one is 2 volumes. Not only is it possible, but as you see, it's been done. It is possible for a person to master that evidence and to subsume it all within a single volume, or at the most 2, because there is a much more limited body of ancient data. That is the single greatest difference between the study of ancient history and the study of more recent periods. The body of ancient material is finite. It is pretty well known, I would say. I don't want to give you the wrong idea. It is mostly pretty well known. It has been known for most of its history, at least for most of the history of scholarship on the ancient world. But at the same time, though, it is also patchy and sometimes even contradictory. This makes the study of the ancient world a very difficult and challenging business. And I'll just give you one example of this to illustrate what I mean. It is estimated that of all the literature that was written by the Greeks and Romans combined, of all the writing that was originally out there, maybe the Library of Alexandria or the great libraries of Rome, whatever you want to take your pick of the great sources for that, where all of that literature was held, of all that material, we have less than 5% that has survived, okay? We have less than 5% of all the literature that was originally out there. We know oftentimes authors that we know existed, and we have the names of authors. We even maybe have lists of the works that they wrote, but we do not have those works anymore. Some works have survived entirely. We only have really a couple of authors whose work have survived totally entire. Plato would be the first one that comes to mind. I guess you can say Homer, even though Homer didn't actually exist, but the Iliad and the Odyssey would be the 2 works ascribed to Homer. But for most authors, everybody besides those ones, for some authors, I'm sorry, for all other authors besides those 2, various percentages of their work survive complete, and other parts of their writings don't survive at all. Some survive in summary form, kind of like the ancient cliff notes of the ancient Roman world. We have some of those. But now the reasons for that are very interesting. It is not because of the standard popular image out there that is presented in very bad Hollywood movies that depict ravening crowds of Christians burning down libraries because they can't handle scientific knowledge or some fanciful nonsense like that. No, the reason why most writings have not survived from ancient times is simply because all it would take for a book not to survive, or a scroll not to survive from the ancient world, is for people to do nothing. And the ravages of time would take care of everything else. It's a miracle that anything has survived, actually, because if you think about how difficult it would have been for, let's say, somebody who wrote something in 5th century Athens, okay, 2,500 years ago, for it to make its way all the way down to the modern period. That means basically every couple of generations, maybe at the most 2 or 3 generations, before the papyrus on which it was written begins to totally deteriorate and worms eat it, somebody who knew how to read and write had to copy it over. Okay, literacy rates in the ancient world were very low. You had to have a person who had enough money to be able to, commission somebody who could read and write to copy that thing over. And that process had to occur basically every century until the Middle Ages, when a monk would copy it over. And then finally, starting in the 1400s, the printing press. Okay, so it's really an amazing thing that anything has survived. All of this literature that we do have has survived, but nevertheless, a lot of it doesn't. Okay, so for some authors, we have very little stuff. And in general, the body of ancient literature and historical writings among those are patchy and shifting in terms of their reliability. It is a very difficult matter to master all of this, to interpret all of these things correctly. An analogy I once heard about studying the ancient world really puts it very nicely. And that is, if you ever were to go to Versailles, okay, Versailles, of course, the great palace of Louis XIV in France, and it's this enormous, complex of buildings. But if you were to go there, studying ancient history is kind of like looking through the keyholes at Versailles. You can see some rooms very clearly. and you know exactly what's in them. And then there are other parts off to the side that you know are there, but you can't quite see them correctly. And you know there's some parts of the room that you cannot see at all, but you know that those parts are there. But then there are whole wings of the palace that you don't even know weren't there. You don't even, it's kind of like that famous quote from Donald Rumsfeld, about the unknown knowns and the known knowns and all that stuff. There are whole floors, wings, and levels of the palace that we cannot see. And to put a finer point upon it, there are areas of the ancient world that are inaccessible to us by the nature of the evidence that we have presented to us or that has survived over the intervening centuries. This makes the establishment of facts in ancient history much more difficult than it is in modern periods. No one doubts, for instance, that the Second World War started when it did. No, people know the exact minute that John F. Kennedy was shot and finally passed away, and so on. Establishing facts like that in the ancient world and in the study of Rome in particular are often very, very difficult. We do know that Caesar was killed on the 15th of March in 44 BC. That's a very well-known fact. Other facts, though, are less clear to us. The order of events is often a matter of tremendous debate. And this is the sort of thing that whole academic careers are built on. I'll just give you one example. The issue of the breakout of the Second Punic War, which we will look at in great detail later in our course. It's a very important period of time in early Roman history. But it is a matter of great debate. This was a war that almost eliminated Rome from the face of the planet because the Carthaginian general who led them was one of the greatest military minds that ever lived, a man named Hannibal, who we'll be studying. This war started in Spain, and it started over a dispute about a rather inconsequential place in Spain called Segundum. It is a matter of tremendous debate, though, over the nature of Roman and Carthaginian relations that led up to the dispute over this town, Segundum. It is a matter of tremendous scholarly debate. What was the nature of the agreement about the spheres of influence in Spain between Rome and Carthage? When was their agreement reached? Where did Segundum fit into that agreement? When did the Romans establish a friendship with Segundum that allowed them ultimately to side with this rather insignificant place and start a war with Carthage? Not that the Romans actually started the war, but it was the spark that ignited this massive conflict. But the point is, all of these basic facts, these fundamental facts, as to the start of this titanic struggle between these great states, are all matters of debate, okay? They are not matters of certainty, you see? And that's one of the major things that separates us from that's what distinguishes ancient history, is that you have to argue and make cases for interpretations of evidence that in modern history you simply do not have to do. I don't mean to give you the idea that modern scholars are all just one big happy family sitting around in agreement with each other, that everything is so open and simple. That's not actually the case at all. It's far from it. But because of this limited body of evidence, the scope of interpretation by modern scholars is far broader for the study of the ancient world than it is for the modern. Okay, it's possible to have diametrically opposing interpretations of the same event that in more modern history are not as likely to happen. The sorts of things that classical scholars argue about are of fundamental importance, whereas the interpretation of more modern events tend to be about more kind of marginal issues to the main event. Okay, the things that are less certain are the less important issues, or the things that are kind of more on the level of analysis than they are on the level of fact. Interpretation in the study of the ancient world is far broader than it is for the study of the modern world, and this leads to what we might call the absence of certainty. Okay, there are certain things that we know. Remember the keyhole image. We can see through the keyhole into certain parts of the palace, but there are whole areas of the palace that we cannot see. Certainty is very much the rare bird, therefore, in the study of ancient Rome. There are certain things that we can absolutely say with confidence if the ancient evidence is focused on those things, but then there are other things that are not. Okay, that we cannot say that about. And this is what we will be seeing in a moment, actually. I want to get more into detail about that actually right now, but more often than not, what you have in the study of the ancient world, and ancient Rome in particular, are competing reconstructions, competing models to explain the events that we have preserved for us in the ancient evidence. This means there are few definitely correct answers that can be given to very many fairly fundamental questions about the facts of the ancient Roman world. I don't want to oversimplify here, but there are certainly issues that remain a matter of tremendous discussion and debate, fundamental issues that are forced upon the modern ancient historian looking at the ancient world by the nature of the evidence. And now, speaking of evidence, I now want to turn to that. So if you are following along inside of the notes, which I hope you are, we're now looking at the second section of that, the part that is called the sources, okay? The sources, essentially, all history, not just Roman history, but all history, are can be divided basically up into two categories. Okay, the first of those are called the primary sources. Okay, the primary sources. All history is based on what are called primary sources. Primary sources can be broadly defined as those that derive from the period under study. That is, even though they can vary in terms of their focus and quality, there are things that come from the period itself, okay, from the ancient period itself. In periods as long as the period of Rome, they can be far removed from one another. They can even be far removed from the period of time that the ancient source is writing about. So, for instance, one of the big sources that will be coming up again and again is a fellow named Plutarch, who was a Greek, an ethnic Greek living under the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD. And he wrote many biographies of ancient Roman and Greek figures, sometimes stretching as far back as people who lived 900 years before him. So he begins his parallel lives of the Greeks and Romans by writing about a fellow named King Romulus, the first king of Rome, who lived 900 years previously, if he lived at all, which, just to spoil it, he didn't. But what would, even if he did, what would Plutarch know about Romulus? Okay, if you wrote about somebody 900 years before you, would you really be considered a contemporary? I think not. And that is a good point. But nevertheless, we still classify Plutarch, no matter what he is writing about in the ancient world, as a primary source, because he is a member of the ancient world. He is an ancient Roman, an ethnic Greek, but still a Roman citizen who thought, lived, and experienced antiquity in a way that no amount of research by a modern scholar could ever hope to replicate. So the primary sources, in the broadest definition, are those sources that derive from the period under study, even if they are focusing on eras or subjects far removed chronologically from the lifetime of the author in question. Now, if we have primary sources, you won't be surprised to hear that we also have secondary sources. Secondary sources are modern works by modern scholars who are reconstructing, assembling, and interpreting the ancient data to write on a subject such as the Senate of Imperial Rome, or the life of Julius Caesar, or whatever. It is important to stress that these sources are literally secondary. Okay, they are all grounded in the primary evidence. If there are primary or ancient, if there were no primary or ancient sources of evidence, then there would be no secondary scholarship at all. Okay, so they are not only secondary in terms of time, but they're secondary in terms of priority as well. Okay, that they take their source all from the ancients. Now, before looking at the nature of the primary sources, I do believe it is important to assess quickly some different approaches, some methodological approaches that have, or theoretical approaches that have been taken to interpreting the ancient data over the years. Looking particularly at history writing, the writing of ancient history as an art, or as some might argue, a science, there have been different methodological or theoretical approaches to the ancient evidence. Now, of course, I mentioned that just now that I called the writing of history a science or an art. In its original form, history writing was actually a genre of literature. This is how it was for the ancients themselves. They were concerned, yes, to find the truth out about the past, their own or whomever they were studying about, but their works were fundamentally works of literature. And this tradition lived on right up until that guy I mentioned at the beginning of our talk today, Edward Gibbon and the Fall of the Roman Empire, which can be studied as much today as a work of literature as a work of history, a good work of history, but it is very literary in its approach. Well, let me just kind of deal with this issue. So there have been some methodological kind of approaches taken, different methodological approaches to the ancient evidence. In the 19th century, especially in Germany, where classics, Altertumswissenschaft really kind of like came into its own in the modern age, history became more scientific, okay? I might use the word scientific in quotation marks there, because it is a big question as to whether history is scientific at all, or whether it is purely an art. But nevertheless, in the 19th century, historians, especially historians of ancient Rome, began to take a more scientific approach to the study of the past, okay? Broadly, their approach was what came to be known at that time as positivism. Okay, positivism. This is a term, if you studied, Augustus Comte or any of these other kind of 19th century figures, the idea of positivism is that you cannot believe anything that you cannot somehow posit or quantify or document or, basically measure it, put it in a box, pin it to the wall. Positivism is the assemblage of every available piece of ancient data about the subject under study. So it is no coincidence that it is at this very period in the 19th century that the great collections of Latin inscriptions began. Okay, some of them are still ongoing. The Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum began in the 19th century along with many other ones as well. And that one is outdated at this point, but there are new versions of it that are coming out. The assemblage, that is, of every Latin inscription that we know of, was a major preoccupation of these 19th century positivists. And that gradually, they would gradually publish all of these things since the 19th century, because the positivists demanded that all the evidence be readily available to hand. Their job was to assemble every piece of data concerning the subject that they wanted to study, and then to present those data in gargantuan footnotes, usually along with their various interpretations and the interpretations of other scholars with whom they're disputing or agreeing or whatever the case may be. As I said, whole academic careers have been made arguing over, the use of the semicolon in Aeschylus or something like that. Well, the positivist view is fundamentally that we cannot step beyond the boundaries of the ancient evidence. If we revert to our model of the palace at Versailles, all we can write about is what we can actually see, okay? If there are wings of the ancient past, that is the palace of the ancient past that we cannot see, then we cannot make any statements about them either way. We have to accept the fact that we do not know those things and move on. Positivism as an approach, as a theoretical or methodological approach, was very successful, extremely successful in establishing an awful lot of information about the ancient past, especially when it was focused on the things that the ancient sources themselves were interested in, namely politics and military matters. As long as you were studying the wars of the Romans or the development of the Roman Republic, then you had lots of information available to you. So the positivist exercise was very successful in those spheres for many years and many decades. And in fact, in some quarters, it is still ongoing. However, in the 20th century, particularly since World War II, a new branch of study emerged, a new kind of theoretical approach to history emerged, and it can't be classified in any simple way. I will simply term it the new historical approach. The new historical approach was concerned with writing history from the bottom up. What does that mean? The new history said, well, if there was a Roman Empire, and we would be looking at the politics and military endeavors of the Romans, then we would be looking at a minute fraction of the Roman Empire, okay? Life wasn't just about politics and military matters. What is everyone else doing? What are the farmers doing? What is the life of a slave like? What about the woman who is kept indoors? What about the marginalized brigands of Roman society? What about the people whom the sources don't write about directly, but who show up from time to time, being alluded to in the sources. They show up as anecdotes or are assumed to exist and may be assumed to be present in the room, but we never hear about them. No slave wrote anything, no servant wrote a memoir or something like that. We have to infer what life was like from the things that people do, the offhanded comments people in the sources do make. For instance, a slave is assumed to be there at an ancient description of a dinner party that we have. What was the dinner party like from the slave's perspective, rather than from that of the people who are eating the food? This is the sort of type of question the new historians from the bottom up would ask. When they came across, when they tried to investigate these subjects, they did not have much evidence. The ancients only wrote about the sorts of things upper class people were interested in. And we will see that most of all, and if you do pursue the study of ancient Roman literature on your own, you will see that very readily. So what does the new historical person approach then do? Well, to fill out the whole picture, they say that if we can't see the whole wings of the palace at Versailles, let's look at other palaces that we do know about and try to extrapolate. Let's look at comparative data. If we, for instance, are studying slaving societies, what do other slaves in other societies feel about their condition? If we have nothing about the ancient Roman slave actually written down, what do other slaves think? We have information from America in the antebellum South, from slaves, say, in Brazil, and so forth. Let's use that. They are sociological and social scientific in their theoretical approach. So as to fill out the whole picture, they will use anthropological theory, anthropological analysis of other cultures and societies to help fill out the gaps in the ancient evidence. And this approach has been extremely productive, very successful, I would say. And I will just like to read you a quote from one of its best practitioners, its best proponents, though he was not an ancient historian. He was a historian of modern England. But he writes, I think, the single best sentence that summarizes this approach to history from the bottom up and the whole thesis of it. That is, I refer to E.P. Thompson, a writer of British history, who in the classic historical work, The Making of the English Working Class, published in 1968, writes the following sentence. I am seeking to rescue the poor stockinger, the Luddite cropper, the obsolete handloom weaver, the utopian artisan, and even the deluded follower of Joanna Southcott, she was kind of a cult figure, from the enormous condescension of posterity. That last phrase is very famous, by the way, the enormous condescension of posterity. This is the attitude of the new history summarized in a nutshell. If we were to transpose it to the ancient world, we might say, I am seeking to rescue the slave, the freedman, the brigand, the poor small holder of the Roman Republic from the enormous condescension of posterity. The exact same mentality is applied in the study of the ancient past for the new historians who focus on antiquity. All right, so we have the positivists, we have the new historians. The most recent and most controversial approach is that of the postmodernists. Now, for all of you Jordan Peterson fans out there, you certainly will know what I mean by postmodernism. Postmodernism is a movement. We don't have to get into the other aspects of it besides history. But as far as history is concerned, it really stems from a kind of literary critical approach that emphasizes the nature of the text above everything else. It denies the ability of the reader to reconstruct authorial intent and emphasizes only the reader's interpretation of any given text, be that text the back of a matchbox or Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. It doesn't matter. It is what the reader draws out of the text that is important. The basic underlying philosophical assumption here is that there is no truth. There is no absolute truth of anything. It's all whatever one makes of the text, the construction of text that we as readers do when we read. This, as I say, is a literary critical approach that, because history is a text-based discipline, you can imagine has severe ramifications for the study of the past. The postmodernist historian would deny that we can ever reconstruct the past, that we can ever know as the German positivists of the 19th century would say, wie es eigentlich gewesen, how it actually happened, how history actually happened. We cannot get behind the text that we read about the past. Postmodernists talk about constructing history rather than reconstructing it. You see, you construct your history, you don't reconstruct it. Well, how do you construct history? You construct history in your own image. You construct history in the image of your own cultural prejudices, gender biases, racial prejudices. And you can see that this is the sort of thing that is very popular nowadays. So the act of the postmodernist historian who is coming to enlighten us, to deconstruct the history and present us with, our own foibles, our own failings, to present a history of the past that really suits the position of the teller of the story. That is the approach of the postmodernist. Now, just to do quick work around that, I don't intend to adopt a postmodernist or even a positivist approach in this course. I extend my apologies, of course, to postmodernists and positivists who might be out there. But what I do intend to do is to adopt a broadly new historical approach. I believe that comparative data and the insights of the social sciences can be very helpful when we look at the societal aspects of our subject. I definitely do believe that we can access truth and that we can actually know things for sure. And although some things might be left tentative and plausible, nevertheless, we can have access ultimately to truth on about many, many things. For the political and military spheres, we have a lot of ancient evidence about these subjects. And so I can adopt perhaps a broadly positivist approach there. The postmodernist view, I'm afraid, will not be one that is expounded at all, though. Now, I don't want to oversimplify things too much because I kind of just said it right now. I kind of mixed the two. I said, I'll be taking a new historical approach and then to some degree a positivist approach. That is sort of the way it works. Different methodological approaches can exist at the same time. And I can quote actually from the preface of a book written as recently as 1979, which I know doesn't sound recently to you. That I can assure you, though, I was born that year, so that is recent. And it was written by a man who is, he's no longer alive now, but he's one of the leading historians, really, of Roman history in the last generation, Fergus Miller, who was a professor at Oxford. And just to show you, the book is called The Emperor in the Roman World. And one of his sentences in the very opening of the work shows you that you can have positivism and new historicism, kind of, and even other methodological approaches all working simultaneously. The issue of the approach to the ancient evidence itself is a focus of debate. And as I said, this is what Fergus Miller says at the preface to his study of the Emperor in the Roman World in 1979. In preparing the work, I have rigidly avoided reading sociological works on kingship and related topics, or studies of monarchic institutions on societies other than those of Greece and Rome. That would be, remember I said, the new historical approach. I am purposely conscious that I will have involved considerable losses of participants and an awareness of whole ranges of questions that I could have asked. Nonetheless, I am confident that the loss in the opposite case would have been greater. For to have come to the subject with an array of concepts derived from the study of other societies would merely have made an even more unobtainable, would have made even more unobtainable the proper objective of the historian. Okay. In other words, what he's trying to say here is that he has to subordinate himself entirely to the evidence and to the conceptual world of the society of the past. And that is a positivistic approach. Yet on other occasions inside of his work, and even here in this sentence, in this passage, he does clearly say that he was willing to look at anthropological studies, but for the ancient world. So he does have a kind of new historical approach there. So even though he does say that, the purpose of the historian is to subordinate himself to the evidence, nevertheless, he can make use of these other approaches as well. The purpose of the historian is to subordinate himself to the evidence. Now, what is the ancient evidence then? I hear you ask. Broadly speaking, our ancient evidence falls into two classes: archaeological and literary. Archaeological evidence is defined as any and all physical material from the ancient past. So you can imagine that it will encompass a wide array of evidence. And I would further classify it as sort of macro and micro evidence. Macro physical evidence will be forms of evidence like entire cities, like Pompeii in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. We have innumerable cities, though, not just Pompeii, from the ancient world. The most famous definitely is Pompeii, but nevertheless, we have lots of other cities all throughout the Roman Empire, North Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. Pompeii was buried by Mount Vesuvius in the year 79 AD, and buried under the volcanic mounds of ash at a nearby city named Herculaneum, and Vesuvius too. But buried under that volcanic mud were all sorts of things. The whole city is preserved for us there. But there are cities, as I said, spread all over the Roman world. We find cities in the sands of Tunisia and Syria, or the remnants of forts, cities and towns in northern England. So the macro evidence would embrace cities and buildings, large artifacts that have been identified through archaeological investigation. Not all of it was conducted in the most scientific way initially. As I said, archaeology kind of began really as treasure hunting. People just looking for cool things to bring home and put on the mantle or sell. But nevertheless, as time went on, and archaeologists got better at their craft and much more scientific. I also believe that the macro evidence would include some rather dramatic evidence, such as human bodies. We get bodies from graves and burials. Burials are one of the chief sources of archaeological evidence, actually. Speaking of Vesuvius, from the Vesuvian cities comes incredibly dramatic evidence of people who were killed in the disaster of August 24th, 79 AD, when Mount Vesuvius erupted. And what's interesting is that the excavators, when they were digging through the ash, would occasionally encounter cavities in the ash, that is, hollowed out, emptied cavities inside of the hardened ash. And to find out what was there, or rather what wasn't there, they had the clever idea of pouring plaster of Paris, liquid plaster of Paris, into the cavity, and then they would let it set and excavate all around it. And all kinds of perishable objects showed up: wood, chairs, doors, pieces of furniture would show up. And on many occasions, they would find actual people. Okay, now, the thing is, though, is that the people themselves, their human remains had rotted away and disappeared. But the hardened volcanic mud had cooled enough around them that it hardened and left this hollow cavity. So when they filled it up with plaster, they got a kind of life-size, representation in plaster of the last moments of that person's life. And some of them are very dramatic. People holding up their arms as the lava came down upon them, or a man and a woman holding hands together, laying in bed. Even a dog actually is a pet. You can, unfortunately, I don't have them in the PowerPoint right now. You can take a look at them if you're interested. If you just type in plaster forms at Pompeii. So anyway, really quite dramatic stuff. But the point to make is that the macro evidence is this whole body of evidence, pardon the pun there, that comes from the ancient world, that is large and readily identifiable, and in certain cases can be particularly dramatic, as in the case in the towns around Pompeii and Herculaneum. Okay, now, I mentioned, though, if we have macro, then we have micro. Micro evidence offers something of a different form, which would be all the bits and pieces that show up in and around the macro evidence that one is excavating. It is also extremely valuable. Undoubtedly, the chief form of evidence here would be pottery. Okay, pottery is, of course, fired clay. It is imperishable, therefore. It can be smashed into small fragments, but it doesn't biodegrade, so it survives in the soil for as long as it is there. And vast quantities of pottery have come up from the ancient world. In fact, if you go to Italy, there's a place called Monte Testaccio, which is a huge mountain of pottery, basically shattered ancient Roman pottery, and you could walk around on top of it. It's absolutely enormous. Vast quantities have come down to us. They have been subjected, of course, not every shard, but many pieces have been subjected to extremely close analysis and study, and can tell us an awful lot about the ancient economy, trade routes, who was, bringing what kind of, we know where the certain clay came from. If it came from Rome and it wound up in northern England, we can learn about trade routes. If you go back into the very ancient past, we can also get analysis of pottery stockpiles and decoration to help identify one culture from the other. So pottery is one of the chief forms of microevidence. And we also get textiles, though, little bits of cloth, bones. The bones of animals can tell us what sort of herds people were raising. Textiles would be more rare because textiles do biodegrade. Only in extremely dry or damp conditions do textiles survive. And because of the extremely profitable marriage of science and archaeology, we can use microscopes to identify things like pollen, which can also tell us about what the environment was like, what the grass was like, what particular genus of animals were living around there. Even the types of plants and things like that, besides things that were going on the human level as well. The microevidence really can be micro all the way down to the cellular level, and even using electron microscopes. Archaeological evidence and excavation, therefore, is an extremely valuable tool. And I must stress that even though it is very valuable, it is essentially a destructive process. When you excavate a site, you, for all intents and purposes, destroy it. You can't go back and do it again. Once you have excavated a site, you have disrupted the strata of the site, and it can't be done all over again. So excavation these days is conducted very carefully, and the key job for all archaeologists is to publish their findings. Without the publication of their findings, all the data remains with them, and no one ever knows what they found there. Archaeological evidence is incredibly useful also for identifying what the physical environment of the ancient world was like. But its chief drawback is that it is mute. It's only valuable when it can be interpreted. A pot is a pot. When it is interpreted, when it is analyzed and put together with other evidence to construct, as I say, trading patterns or the like, then it tells us something about the ancient past. But the evidence in and of itself is mute, and therefore it requires argumentation, debate, and conferences and people arguing about what such and such a thing actually means. If you excavate a Roman villa, that is all well and good. You can look at the ground plan of the villa, identify the bathing rooms and the dining rooms, the sleeping cubicles, and so forth. What we can't tell, though, is what were the hopes and dreams of the people like who lived there? What did they believe? How did they look at the world? What stories did they tell their children at night? We can't tell any of that from the archaeological evidence. For that sort of information, you have to go to the written evidence. And so that's the second part of the second type of primary sources, the literary evidence. Now, lucky for us, in the study of ancient Rome, we have a very large body indeed, albeit circumscribed. It's not everything, as I mentioned before, but we have a very large body of written evidence. As I said before, it is not as large as it once was, but it is still a fairly significant amount. Written evidence can, just like physical evidence, could be divided between macro and micro evidence. Literary evidence can be divided broadly into two categories. Ancient literature, and on the one hand, books written by the ancients, and on the other hand, inscriptions, or what may be termed epigraphic material. Epigraphy is the study of ancient inscriptions. Okay, ancient literature is that body of data that has survived over the centuries from the end of antiquity to the modern era, usually being copied over by monks in the Middle Ages. It comprises a large and vast array of genres. We have all kinds of poetry, epic, elegy, love poetry, pastoral poetry, all kinds of letters, correspondences between people, speeches, works written by the ancients about Roman history. Therefore, we have history written by the ancients primary sources that are talking about these historical events, and these are of very, very great importance, primary importance for our interest in this course. But you also have this other wide variety of styles, as I said, plays and all the other genres of literature. All of that gives us insight when it is properly interpreted. It gives us insight into the lives of the ancients, into how they viewed the world in their own words. So it is invaluable as a supplement to the archaeological evidence. And when one uses written and archaeological evidence together, the results can be spectacular. That's every Roman historian's that's the best possible situation when that can happen. When you have a literary source and an inscription that complement one another. On the other hand, the material has survived in copy form. Often our very early texts of this or that author will date only to the 13th, 14th, or even 15th centuries. Okay. In other words, the copies that we have do not go all the way back to the originals. Very, very rarely do any manuscripts go back to the originals at all. In fact, none of them do. None of the go back to the original sources. Like, we don't have anything written by Cicero himself, the actual handwriting of him. It was all copies from later authors. As a result, to a certain degree, it is not a pure chance that these manuscripts have survived. Let me explain what I mean by that. In other words, because we don't have things that are just, from the original person themselves, but have all been copied many, many times by over centuries. In some ways, these works have been selected, you see. To a certain degree, they have been selected by the people who copied them. Something of value was seen in them. And so it was therefore deemed worthy of laborious copying, as I described before, these ancient manuscripts, passing them down from one generation to the next. To a certain degree, that selected body of text, not entirely, comes to us by the vicissitudes of chance, but to a certain degree, it comes to us as a selected body of data. And then, of course, we have to keep that in mind, that there are whole things that were deemed unworthy, you see, of being copied down. Of course, there were standard things that could happen. A fire could randomly happen and wipe out a whole bunch of text that people did want to survive. Worms could eat something, all sorts of things could happen, get lost or whatever. But nevertheless, to some degree, the works that we have been selected, and we have to bear that in mind. When we turn to the other main body of written evidence, that is the inscriptions, this is not the case. See, inscriptions speak to us directly from the ancient past. These actually were things chiseled in stone by an ancient hand. Inscriptions are a class of data that are therefore invaluable for looking at the ancient world. They are carved on stone, sometimes even metal or bone, in fact, but stone usually, and they are written. You could, if you have something that was written on ancient papyrus and it does survive, that would also be considered epigraphic material. But nevertheless, this would also include a whole body of inscriptions that we'll just think about it for a moment ourselves. Where is the most common place that you see inscriptions written on stone in the modern world? The answer to that, of course, is on tombstones, okay? And the same is true for the inscriptions of the ancient world, from the Latin-speaking world. Epitaphs, funerary inscriptions, comprise something like 70%, maybe even 80% of our epigraphic data from the ancient Roman past. Unlike terse epitaphs of the modern age, however, ancient Roman epitaphs can be extremely fulsome and give all sorts of great details and things about the, in modern day times, you just see, born, dead, died, and so on. It's very, very, very short. But in the ancient Roman world, you had all sorts of things about all the military positions that this person held, about how, he was married to this woman for all of his life, and, all the children that he had, and the places he had served in the military, the political offices that he had held, all sorts of great information for the historian. Usually, when these things can be collated compared to literary evidence, as I said before, then you have a real spectacular result, and you can really kind of get a full idea of people. But this whole study of the ancient Roman, who these people were, is greatly benefited by the funerary inscriptions that we have on them. Okay. And when collated, assembled, and studied quantitatively, these funerary inscriptions can be extremely useful. Besides epitaphs, there are all kinds of other inscriptions the ancients put up. The Romans like to inscribe things in stone. So they put up treaties, for instance. They put up laws, tables of laws pertaining to this or that town. They would put up commemorative inscriptions. Publius so-and-so built this bathhouse. Marcus so-and-so restored this portico. They would put up inscriptions that accompanied honorary statutes of important people. Here is this statue of this great guy from this local municipality. Why, you might say? Well, because he gave all this money for a public banquet or whatever. So you have these honorary and commemorative inscriptions of all sorts. You also have interesting texts that are letters. Letters are an important aspect for us because they show us a kind of day-to-day quality that you don't get in polished literary works. Okay, these would go, of course, go under the literary category of written evidence, but they provide us with a greater insight into the day-to-day life. If the emperor takes notice of a town, or for whatever reason, and he might send a letter to a town and say, you guys get such and such privilege, you don't have to pay taxes, or you get to build this thing in my honor, or whatever. Well, that's just the sort of thing, actually, that somebody might turn into an actual inscription. So there's a nice interaction there between the letters, the written letters, and the physical inscriptions carved on stone. Inscriptions can also extend to the more varied and less formal type. In extraordinary circumstances, we can have inscriptions that are painted on walls, essentially pieces of graffiti. There are some that one could quote. There are some that are totally unquotable because, just like modern bathroom graffiti, they're totally obscene. We actually have quite a bit of that from the city of Pompeii, which you see around the Bay of Naples, this is what you see in front of you. There's all sorts of obscene graffiti that the ancient Romans wrote on the walls. There are some that are very interesting. They're, saying such and such, vote for this guy because he brings the best bread, or vote for this one, or whatever, there's even some that say, that I find rather amusing, where you have anti-election notices, saying all the thieves recommend that you vote for this guy. In other words, like, don't vote for that person. Now, these things have not been selected or copied. They simply turn up in archaeological finds. So that makes for a real kind of nice insight into a kind of a little window into what that the Romans were not all that different from us in many ways. Okay, if a later sometimes these an interesting detail is that sometimes these inscriptions would get used by later cultures. So the Romans were great workers with stone. Later cultures sometimes were not. If you have a barbarian tribe, Germans or something like that, roaming around the countryside, they might just hack up the bathhouse and make it into a fort or something like that. But then you've got all these inscriptions there that are now part of this new structure, but that actually came from an old one. So those have to be reconstructed. Those have to be put back together again. Many times inscriptions are very hard to read, for this reason. They're fragmentary. They're missing pieces. I think I have a picture of one that I showed you before. Yeah, there. You see the bottom part of that is all cut off. This one actually is not so hard to read, though. It's pretty straightforward. Sometimes you'll even see pieces of stone like this, ancient Roman inscriptions used in cathedrals and in places from the Middle Ages. Why go to a quarry and dig up new stone? That's really hard to do. Why not just go and dismantle the local Roman ruin that's in town, and you can then turn it into, use that for part of your building materials. So inscriptions can be found in all sorts of contexts, not just dug up in scientific archaeological excavations. Now, the ancient written evidence does have its limitations. In the case of literature, first of all, I already mentioned that it has been selected, and so that already is a limitation. Another one would be that it was written almost entirely by men, okay? Not just men. We only have one female author to come down from ancient Rome. There's one ancient Greek author too, who's a woman, whose work has come down, and both of them are in highly fragmentary form. But not just men, but also men who were aristocrats, and not just men who were aristocrats, but also men who were aristocrats who lived in Rome. If you think of the size of the empire, and by the usual number that historians give for the population of the high empire was 60 million people. That's a lot of people, and yet we have this very, very small slice of writers, all men, aristocrats who come from Rome, people of a certain class. As I said, no, you have no slaves, almost no women, very few anybody else really who's not part of that upper crust. And moreover, even in terms of a further delimitation, the period of time that our literary sources come from, they really don't really start in full until about 200 BC, and they go primarily to about 200 AD. Most Roman literature falls within that chronological bracket. So it is a very circumscribed, very focused body of material that addresses the interests of an upper class males living in Rome in this 400-year period. Okay, that is a severe limitation, and even at that, those works have been selected. Inscriptions, likewise, sometimes can be very formulaic, while epitaphs, laws, and election notices can all be very informative. They are nonetheless a certain type, certain style or class of material. They tend to use the same sort of language again and again. An honorary inscription commemorating the erection of a building will have the same sort of formulae again and again, whether it be found in Syria, Scotland, France, or Germany. You have the same sort of data. It is not like you're going to find an inscription with the life of the Emperor Claudius or something like that carved on stone. That is just not going to turn up. So again, it is limited. It is valuable, but it is limited. And I'll just close with one last, or rather two last types kind of sui generis evidence, ancient evidence. That would be coins and papyrus. Okay, coins, especially Roman imperial coins, are the model of our own modern coins. They had on one side the head of the ruler, usually with an inscription around the side of the head, saying what a great guy he was or identifying him in one of his titles. So they can be dated very precisely, actually, because of that. On the other side, on the side opposite the head, they would often have a propaganda message, usually saying what a wonderful place the Roman Empire is to live, or what a good job Emperor X is doing by ruling it, some kind of catchphrase or whatever. So coins are sort of quasi-archaeological, quasi-written material all at once. They can be studied as archaeological artifacts in and of themselves, or they can be read as texts. And they do provide a very valuable service in this regard for the historian, of reconstructing what was the imperial message at the time. What was it that the emperor was trying to communicate? Because, coins they were in an age before mass communication, before television or, Instagram. How did you get your message across if you were a politician? You got it across by having your face out there, either on statues or more, but the most widely traversed piece of piece of propaganda would be a coin, right? If you remember, even in the Gospels, when the disciples of the Lord asked Christ, is it lawful to give taxes to Caesar? And he says, bring me a coin. And he asks them, whose image is on there? And they all say, Caesar, you see? And then, of course, he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and unto God what is God's. But the point I'm trying to make here is that Caesar's face was readily identifiable in a very, very far-flung part of the empire in the Middle East. You see? That's the point, is that the emperor's image was put out there primarily by coins. So, and whatever propaganda message was being put on the back of that. Okay, so we will have recourse to coins. The last one is papyrus. Papyrus is also a kind of sui generis, in the class by itself, written piece of evidence. It's odder in form as a form of data than coins, in that it only survives in extremely dry, or ironically extremely wet conditions, but extremely dry is the ones that we have. It is the form of ancient paper. In fact, it is even the origin, the etymology of the word paper. Written in ink on this dried out piece of papyrus that has been glued together. Probably the most famous collection of papyri are the Dead Sea Scrolls from the ancient past. Very unique find, but again, a very rare form of evidence, and it demands a very, very high degree of specialized skill in reading them. Okay, so papyrus is very, very hard to read. Inscriptions can be very hard to read. You have to be trained very well to be able to read those things. Papyrus, even more so, because you're also dealing with holes, you're dealing with, burn marks and other things that, it would be kind of like this. If a scholar has, unearthed an old chewed up piece of papyrus for a document that we don't have any other source for, this is a very, very special thing. But how do you read it? Well, it would be kind of like this. The analogy that I've always heard that I like a lot is if, let's say, a friend of yours Xeroxed some notes for you from a book, but they accidentally took off an inch or two from the right-hand column, the right-hand margin of the book. You know how that happens sometimes when you're Xeroxing. You leave off, so you don't put it right on this machine. Because you speak English fluently, you'll be able to figure out what's in those missing places. You see, you'll be able to kind of gather generally what the idea is from that, or maybe even deduce the exact words. One's Latin and Greek has to be so good that you can do that with a missing part of a stone inscription or a missing part of papyrus. Okay. And I hasten to add, it's becoming a more and more lost art. Very sadly, as Latin and Greek become less and less well studied, even among classicists, it's a very tragic thing. But anyway, that's another story. So you put it all together. This is the body of ancient material that we're dealing with. This is when, if somebody asks you, how do you know that all of this happened? Or if you're wondering that yourself, as you hear me, going on about this or that event, how do you know that even happened? This is the evidence that we're going by. Literary texts that talk about it from the ancient world, inscriptions, coins, papyrus, and archaeological evidence, all combined to give us a wide-ranging, broad, although nevertheless limited scope of the events of ancient history. Okay, but of course, always being open to various interpretations, as I've mentioned many times already. Okay, my friends. Now, do we need a little break? Would you like to take 10 minutes? We can totally do that. I'm gonna. All right. Welcome back, my friends. So having surveyed the introductory materials, it's now time to turn our attention to the ancient world itself. We set the situation as it existed in pre-Roman Italy. The Romans were not the first people to inhabit the Italian peninsula. They were not even the first people to become powerful or influential within the Italian peninsula. It is worth examining, therefore, what the situation was and what the Romans felt as they emerged as a major power in the region in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. I will begin by looking at the overall geography of the Italian peninsula and how it benefited the ancient inhabitants there. Then we will examine in sequence the non-urbanized tribal cultures of pre-Roman Italy, the Greek colonists in the southern part of Italy and Sicily, and we will then treat the latter ones, the Greeks in the south, we will treat rather briefly. And then we will look at the people who were often erroneously described as mysterious, that is the Etruscans, who are not really all that mysterious at all, as we will see. So first of all, let's take a look at the geography of the Italian peninsula as a whole. Italy is very well watered because of its mountainous nature. In the north, as you see here, are the towering Alpine ranges, the Alps mountains, which are permanently snowbound, and so offer plenty of rivers and streams to the northern part of the peninsula. Down the spine of Italy, Italy is oftentimes compared to a woman's boot, so that you have the knee of Italy, you have the shin, you have the toe, and the instep, and all of that. Well, if you're looking down kind of the spine of Italy, in the north, you have the Apennine Mountains. They are not as high as the Alps and are not permanently snowbound, but they do offer, especially in the wintertime, an abundance of water, streams, and springs to feed the inhabitants. The largest rivers in Italy, at least the ones that we are going to be focused on, are three. The Po River in the north, which runs from east to west, sort of from the land over to, from the Venice, which is up and around here. I'm sorry, Venice is right over here. The Arno River in north central Italy. This is near the. This is in the area. The Arno is right there. This is the area where Florence is, and this is the one of the borders of the ancient Etruscan homeland that we're going to be learning about. And then, of course, lastly is the Tiber River, which is where the city of Rome itself is situated. The mountainous nature of Italy also offered the people plenty of wood and pasture land for sheep and goats, which were raised in great profusion, as archaeology makes clear, and still are to this day, in fact. Aside from the mountains, there are coastal plain areas in Italy, and three of those are worth looking at. The first one isn't actually coastal, it is the Po Valley, the river valley of that major river in the north of Italy, and which offers a very wide expanse, the widest expanse indeed in the country, of fertile arable land. Also, we will be looking at the plain of Latium, modern-day Lazio, which is immediately to the south of the settlement of Rome. The Latins, as we will see, were to receive the close attention of the Romans for several centuries before the rest of the Italians and ultimately the rest of the inhabitants of the Mediterranean did. So we have to understand that at this early stage, there are non-Roman Latins, you see. We're getting to them, but the whole plain of Latium, which the people who inhabit that are called Latins, that was around Rome. Okay, Rome was initially just this kind of city-state. South of Latium, around the area of Naples, which would be right around in here. Yes, I'm sorry, right around, yeah, in this area right here. In the area around Naples is the plain of Campania. Campania is extremely fertile because it has Mount Vesuvius located near it. Mount Vesuvius is an active volcano and erupted, as we mentioned before, spectacularly in 79 AD, burying the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, leaving us with a great archaeological treasure trove. And also, but because of the volcanic minerals in the soil there, it offers the plain of Latium an agricultural treasure trove of being especially fertile, because the slopes of the mountain are so filled with this rich volcanic mineral soil that it became a very popular place for wine growing in ancient times. And I'll just kind of, by way of an aside, presage some later talk about about the culture of the Roman aristocracy by saying that Campania was essentially the equivalent of the Roman aristocracy's Florida. That was the area that they all like to hang around in and relax and go on their holidays. So it's a beautiful environment. There is, in fact, an old saying, look upon the Bay of Naples and die. The idea being that it's so beautiful, there's nothing else left to see as beautiful. It is a great physical setting, but also there were natural hot springs there and so forth. And very quickly, the plain of Campania and the towns around it, it became kind of a holiday resort for the Roman well-to-do. As to Latium itself, it is bordered on its northern edges, as I've said, by the river Tiber. And on its western side by the Mediterranean Sea, and on its east and south by mountains. In the center of the plain of Latium, down the Alban Hills, are a low-lying range of hills, which are, they were actually to become a religious focal point for the people, the early inhabitants of Latium, the Latins. By the time of Roman expansion in Italy, however, all these plains and the others that I haven't mentioned, the lowlands of Italy, were all well worked by agriculturists. In the mountains tended to reside more pastoral people, More on that later on. But this was a well-settled region by the time the Romans emerged as a power in the area of Italy. But what about the people themselves? With the exception of the Greek colonizers in the south and the Etruscans in ancient Etruria, modern-day Tuscany, more towards the north, that area around Florence. This area here you can see Etruria. The Italian peninsula was occupied by non-urbanized tribal peoples. That means these people did not have large cities. They tended to live in villages in loose tribal arrangements led by chieftains or clans. They would often have specific sites they shared for religious purposes, which offered a focal point for their cultures. But they were living what would be termed by archaeologists as an Iron Age lifestyle, a tribal, non-urbanized lifestyle. Archaeology is clear that the first inhabitants of Italy went back to the Stone Age. The period before 400 BC, however, is very difficult to reconstruct. We have fragmentary references by Greeks to the situation in Italy prior to 400 BC, but they are, as I say, extremely sketchy and lain over with legends and myth, which makes it very difficult for the historian trying to reconstruct the situation in the era before 400 BC. Our two main avenues into the prehistoric period of Italy are, unsurprisingly, archaeology, and secondly, perhaps surprisingly, linguistics. Archaeology, as we have seen before, is a very valuable tool for the ancient historian, churning up an enormous variety of ancient evidence, ancient artifacts which can be studied. Then there is the prehistoric period. That means the period before we have any kind of extant literary or written evidence whatsoever. And so archaeology is essentially all we have to work with. But as we have already seen from looking at archaeology, everything depends upon the interpretation of that data. And it is safe to say that archaeology offers us two ways of examining and trying to make sense of the cultural patterns of pre-Roman Italy. One is examination of burial styles, whether the people inhumed their dead, that is, buried them whole, or whether they cremated them. Often cultures can be determined by whether or not they used cremation or inhumation. The other main avenue is pottery styles. Types of pottery, types of pots and decorative techniques on those pots are also used in combination with burial styles and settlement patterns to try to deduce the different classes of people who occupied early Italy. Now, this course, of course, is not on early Italy, so I'm not going to go into any tremendous detail about the various types of cultures that have been located there, but suffice it to say that now a reasonably good picture of the situation in prehistoric Italy can be reconstructed. We see people there from the Stone Age that continue into the Bronze Age, say 1000 BC. There is tremendous growth in population of the pre-Roman people of Italy. They start to become more profuse, their settlements become more common, and their burials become more common because there are more people to bury. Now, what about the linguistic evidence? I did mention that just now. Well, linguistic evidence is also very useful. So far, at least 40 languages have been identified that were spoken in pre-Roman Italy. 40 languages or dialects of languages may be more accurate. The difference between those two is not always so hard to, always so easy to tell. But that is a lot of languages. These dialects are known to us often from fragmentary inscriptions that have been found inscribed, as I say, on stone or pieces of pottery. They are fragmentary. And now I'm going to introduce you to a new meaning of the word fragment. There are also fragments, in another sense, that have been left over in later authors who quote ancient formulae that seem to incorporate these ancient languages. Now, so there is a physical kind of fragment when you find a shard of pottery, but then there's also a fragment, a literary fragment, when a person, a later author whose work does survive, quotes an earlier work that only exists in this one quotation. That quotation is a fragment. Okay, so the word fragment can have these two distinct meanings when used by ancient historians. What is the historical significance of the linguistic evidence? Well, we might put it in this way: what does this multitude of languages and their various classifications tell us about the historical processes that determine the population pattern of pre-Roman Italy? That is a difficult question to answer. Are we talking about language groups supplanting other language groups because of invasion? We don't know. Is it because of trade, emulation, migration, acculturation? What is going on here? That is the historical process behind this quilt of pre-Roman Italic languages. And it is a matter for debate, and we will have to leave that to the experts in the field. I do just want to draw your attention to that, to the fact that it is a matter, it is part of the, the whole historical inquiry of this period. But as far as we can tell, the broad division between the peoples of pre-Roman Italy was that of agriculturalists in the lowland, and often very warlike pastoralist people living in the hills or foothills of the mountains that are so common across the peninsula. Sometime around 600 BC, a major shift took place in the population of Italy in the north. Starting at about this time, people from across the Alps began to infiltrate into the northern parts of Italy. These people are known in our sources as, well, the Romans called them the Galli, that would be the Gauls. The Greeks referred to them as the Keltoi, or the Celts. They refer to the same group of people, though. The Gauls or the Celts are the same group of people. People who are some of the most ancient people ethnically of all of Europe. They were in the northern part of Europe, a very dominant culture in the Iron Age. But the Celts seem to have arisen in the area of modern-day Austria originally, but it's debated. But then, nevertheless, they spread westward to eventually occupy most of France and parts of Germany, Spain, and of course the British Isles, where we associate the term Celtic, with Ireland and Scotland and stuff like that. But and that indeed that would be still a part of their sphere for a very, very long time to come, to this day, in fact. But nevertheless, they did occupy whole huge swaths of ancient Western Europe. Starting around 600 BC, they also began to cross, as I say, the Alps. This would have been some feat, since crossing the Alps without anything but goat tracks to follow must have been quite difficult. Well, what is happening here? Are these Celts invading? Are these large bodies of armed men coming in and taking over the northern part of Italy, the Po Valley? Or are they gradual migrations, filtrations with women and children that take place over centuries? It is very hard to tell. The archaeological evidence doesn't really give us a firm answer. It is especially considering the time period, this very, very early time period. What is going on here is very hard to say. We can say that though by about 500 BC, the whole of the Po Valley, so that's all of this area up here, what the Romans would call Gallia Cisalpina, or Cisalpine Gaul, Gaul this side of the Alps. You see here is Gaul across the Alps, Transpadane Gaul, Gaul across the Alps, and here is Gaul this side of the Alps. The Romans would classify all of this area as part of Gaul because it was totally inhabited by Gauls, even though it was part of mainland Italy. And it was not until much later that it was actually classified as part of Roman Italy. Italia started south of Gallia Cisalpina. Okay, everything south of here was Italy. This was all lumped together with southern France and everything that was Gaul up there. The whole northern plain was originally considered by the Romans as not part of Italy. In this picture of pre-Roman Italy, we have the Celtic Gauls, therefore, in the north, but then we have various Italic tribal cultures. That's the word. I know you're thinking italics is like slanted type, but originally it meant, in this case, it means people who are, we don't want to use the word Italian because, that implies people from modern day Italy. Italic means these things, just like the same way Germanic is used by historians as opposed to German. Okay. So these various Italic tribal cultures, chief among them in central Italy, are the groups known as the Oscans and the Samnites. We'll be hearing a lot more about the Samnites occupying the central area to the south and east of Latium. In the south of Italy, we also have a group of foreigners, the Greeks. They were not invaders, they were foreign settlers, people from abroad. And you might ask, what were the Greeks doing in Italy? Well, those of you that know Greek history or want to learn, you can take my class in the fall. The Greeks began colonization starting around 800 BC and continued on to about 600 BC, this intense period of colonization where they were sending out colonies from the mainland of Greece west, settling Sicily and all throughout southern Italy. This intense period really goes from 800 to 700 BC, and it would ultimately taper off by about 600 BC. But it was a very intense period of cross-cultural exchange throughout the Mediterranean world, where Greeks were coming from east to west. And they actually would go up to the Black Sea and the southern parts of the Crimea. There's actually wonderful Greek ruins in the area of the Crimea, that, which still exists there in Sevastopol. And they also would come westward as far as Italy and even southern France. In fact, the name of the city of Marseille, where the Marseillaise comes from, it was actually Massilia. It was a Greek colony in the 700s. By the time the Romans began to emerge as a force to be reckoned with in Italy, the Greeks were very well established, therefore had been for centuries in the southern part of Italy and Sicily. Now, I'll just mention a word here, because I did say, why were the Greeks doing this? Why were the Greeks colonizing? Greek colonies were not part of any organized, centralized Greek empire or Greek state. There was no united Greek states in those days. There was just a disparate mass of well over 100 city-states. They were not instruments of imperium, as the Latins would later call it. They were instead, each city-state, basically when they got to the point where there was just too many people to living in that small city-state, they would send out an apoikia. This is the ancient Greek word for a colony. Basically, it means like home away from home, apoikia. And they would settle them out there, and there would be the metropolis, the mother city, that would send it out. And but after they sent out, those city-states became totally their own autonomous units with their own laws, governing bodies, foreign policy, coinage, army, so forth. So these Greek colonies cannot be seen as any part of a concerted attempt by Greece to take over Italy or anything like that. They are merely a pattern of settlement in the southern part of Italy that would have been well established by the time the Romans emerged on the scene. The Greek colonies that we'll be talking about are most commonly Naples, which is actually Neapolis, the new city. This is, of course, a Greek name, founded on the coast of Campania on the mainland, and Tarentum, which is down here in the south, right there, in that area. This was actually to be a major player in Roman history. And finally, possibly the most powerful Greek city-state anywhere in the world would be Syracuse, which is this one down here on the island of Sicily. This was a very powerful state and one to be reckoned with, and one which the Romans saw fit to ally themselves with at first before they attempted to finally take the place over and conquer it, which they did. More on that, although, as time goes on. The Greeks are different from the people that we have looked at elsewhere in the Italian peninsula. These are highly urbanized, highly sophisticated people. Greek culture, of course, was extremely influential, and the process that describes the adaptation, the adoption of Greek ways of doing things or Greek thought is Hellenization, from the Greek word Hellas, Hellene, which simply means Greek, which is the Greek word for Greek, the Hellenes. Hellenization is the process of people adopting Greek manners. And wherever the Greeks went, people somehow tended to get Hellenized. Of course, in general, it tends to be that a simpler culture will emulate a more sophisticated one. That seems to be a general anthropological principle. The Greeks were about as sophisticated as the Mediterranean got at that time. So the influence of the Greeks should not be underestimated. It seems that sometime around the arrival of the Greeks in southern Italy and Sicily, peoples to the north of Rome became heavily Hellenized, and these are the pre-Roman peoples called Villanovans. It's a strange name, I know, but it is the name of the site where the pottery style that identified the culture was found. These Villanovans seem to have arisen to civilization and become known as the Etruscans. Okay, and it is on the Etruscans now that I want to focus for this last portion of this before we move on to the early days of Rome. The Etruscans are often described as mysterious. In popular culture, they still are presented as being somehow mysterious, but this view, although being understandable, is not entirely correct. We have nothing from the Etruscans themselves in terms of long literary treatments of their own history or culture, as we do for the Greeks. and the Romans. We have details of outsiders about them. We have details of the Romans about them, and we have the details of the Greeks about them. We do have archaeological evidence, which is invaluable. We have inscriptions in the Etruscan language. Well, you would say, if we have inscriptions in the Etruscan language, don't we have material from the Etruscans? And the answer is yes, but the problem is that we have difficulty reading it. It was written in quasi-Greek letters, which you can see on the left-hand side of the screen there. And so we can read with the words. There has been a lot of attempt to understand the Etruscan language. If you would like to basically learn everything that we know about it, Larissa Bonfante is the Etruscan language, which she co-wrote with her father, is still the book to go to about this. I had the privilege of studying with her some years ago, actually many years ago. And she's still alive, very, very elderly now, but is still a great scholar, wonderful person. But the point, though, is that even though we can understand quite a bit about the language, it's still rather rough for us. It's still rather hard for us to understand. We do know that the Etruscan language was not Indo-European. Okay, it was one of these one-off languages. And so the material doesn't give us tremendous detail that we have for, say, the Greeks or the Romans. On the other hand, investigation into the Etruscan world in the last 70 years or so has revealed an awful lot about them, and that makes it possible to say that they were not really as mysterious as they often are portrayed. There are still questions about the Etruscans, their origins, and we will look at that, and the nature of their control and their influence in Italy. These are certainly valid historical questions, but what Etruscan society was like, broadly speaking, that we can now safely say we can present in a rather reasonable way. The ancient view of the Etruscans was that they were immigrants from the Eastern Mediterranean. This would certainly explain why their language was so odd, since it bears, as I said, no resemblance to any of the neighboring Italic languages of the ancient peoples bordering the Etruscan lands. Naturally enough, one can say if their language is so odd, maybe they brought it with them from elsewhere. For the longest time, it was considered to be the case that the Greeks and the Romans were right. That is, that the Etruscans were foreigners who had migrated from the eastern half of the Mediterranean. Precisely where, it was unclear, but somewhere from the east, wherever that was. And they had settled, for some reason, in the area of ancient Etruria, which is the area immediately north of Rome, bordered by the Tiber River on the south, the Arno River on the north, and the Apennine Mountains to the east, and the Mediterranean Sea to the west. More recently, though, a lot of archaeological work has revealed that in all likelihood, the Etruscans are native Italian peoples that we call the Villanovans, who raised themselves up to urbanized civilization, possibly, under influence from the Greeks. The archaeological evidence shows that under all the Etruscan cities, there is a Villanovan site. There is no sign of any discontinuity of settlements, invasion, burning, or anything that might suggest the Etruscans came into a situation aggressively, as was the old view of the origins of the Etruscans. So I think we can say relatively safely that on the best available current evidence, the Etruscans are a native Italian, urbanized culture, but under strong Greek influence. That is always important to remember about them. Now, the Etruscans are not a unified people politically. They did have city-states. We hear of a league of 12 cities. It seems there were mutually antagonistic members of this league who often warred with each other, but could act in concerted efforts if threatened or if it was to their advantage. They do seem to have come together for religious purposes. In other words, there is a very common feature of this is a very common feature of these leagues, especially in Greece, where often antagonistic warring polis, city-states, came together to celebrate festivals of a religious or athletic character, often combined, actually. This is an interesting parallel with the Greeks and the Etruscans. The cities themselves appear to have originally been ruled by kings. Again, like the Greeks, by the time that the Romans began to encounter the Etruscans seriously, many of those cities had undergone revolutions. The kings had been overthrown and they were ruled by what we term oligarchies, that is, small groups of very rich and powerful people. It really just means the rule of a few, a handful of people determined either by birth or wealth or some other criteria that demarcates the ruling class from the non-ruling class. Now, there is no doubt that the Etruscans exercised a tremendous influence over central Italy. Debate has recently been rekindled as to the nature of that influence, and this is a good example of what I began our class with today, talking about the sorts of interpretive issues that pervade ancient history, and which raise very important questions. What was the nature of the Etruscan control in Italy? That is a very basic question. It is one that should be able to be answered reasonably, but it turns out to be very difficult. The received view, the view that was very common and is still very common, is that the Etruscans exercised strong political control over Italy from the Po Valley south to Campania. They exercised this primarily on the western seaboard of Italy, but they also crossed the Apennines and exercised some control in the area of modern-day Umbria. This was, if you want to think of it this way, an empire or kingdom of the Etruscans. If you want to think about geography, they were the geography that we just looked at. Rome and the Latins will be in the middle of that empire. Okay. So you see, you have Etruscans up here, and you'll have Etruscans down here too. Okay. Now, people have gone and they have found strong evidence that the Romans were at one stage under the thumb of their northern neighbors. And there is talk of an Etruscan period in Roman history. And as I say, this is a very common view, and it has a lot of supporting evidence in its favor. But I'll just show you, because this is what kind of the fun part of academic squabbles is all about. There was a book published in the mid to late 90s by a guy named Tim Cornell in England called The Beginnings of Rome. Fordham has several copies. If you're up there, you can take a look at it. And Tim Cornell challenges this view of Etruscan domination in Italy. He points out inconsistencies in the pattern of Etruscan evidence across the so-called empire. He says, for instance, if you look at the density of inscriptions, we have a lot of Etruscan inscriptions pertaining to important people. One didn't carve an inscription for a nobody. One carved it for an important person. We have lots of those inscriptions in Etruria itself, not north of Rome, not very many in Latium, and then a lot in Campania, to the south of Rome. Why do we have an Etruscan empire with a big hole in the middle? Why are there so many Etruscans north and south of Latium, but not in Latium itself? He also draws parallels with other archaic cultures, looking at the nature of the upper classes in these archaic cultures and how they can move around freely among each other across these state boundaries. There is an aristocratic ethos among these early cultures, and this does not really fit with the notion of an Etruscan dominance. His picture, therefore, of the nature of Etruscan control in central Italy is of a sphere of influence. Many of the pieces of evidence that one finds for the early Etruscan Empire or the Etruscan Empire in Italy are actually evidence of cultural influence, not political domination. And certainly the cultural influence can't be denied. We see all these, tremendously beautiful Etruscan tomb paintings. The toga was originally an Etruscan article of clothing. This is an Etruscan statue, the Ringatore or orator statue. You can see that the Romans picked that up too. The fasces. This was a very interesting thing that the Romans picked up from the Etruscans. These were symbols of political authority. The word fasces simply means to bind something, as in these red kind of leather thongs that are binding the bundles of sticks and the axe head. The sticks represented the ability to mete out corporal punishment, to the political authority to beat people who were doing something they weren't supposed to be doing, criminals of some kind. And the axe, of course, represented capital punishment, the ability to chop off one's head, someone else's head. But they were symbols of political authority. Really from a very early period on, the Romans adopted these from the Etruscans. And as we'll see during the Republican period, the Romans would walk, all their magistrates would have men walking around behind them with these fasces, because they symbolize political authority. And they have throughout the ages. This is a small aside. We see these right on up in our own Capitol building. This is, you notice the fasces on either side of the flag there. They are symbols of political authority that our own government uses. And That's all well and good. Unfortunately, they have had some rather negative echoes throughout the years. If you think of that word fasces, and then you kind of translate it into Italian, it becomes fascismo. Okay, fascism was the name of the form of government that Mussolini founded. And here you have this symbol of the fasces right there. That's actually the origin of the word right there. So anyway, the point of all this is that we have taken these things over. Sorry, not we. Well, we to some degree, but the Romans took over all of these symbols of authority and cultural stuff. The toga. There are other things too. The curial chair. This is a kind of a throne-like thing that the Roman magistrates, the top magistrates for the years, the consuls would sit on. It too owes its origin to the Etruscans. So there's certainly plenty of cultural influence. That can't be denied. But in Etruria, you have Etruscans. Then they move south, passing by Latium, maybe going by the sea into Campania, which is this area just right around here, where Naples is. You see. And bypassing Rome, okay? You find plenty of Etruscans down there, but not too many in the area of Latium itself, which was densely populated and would be a very difficult place to conquer, as the Romans found out. It was very difficult to move into that place militarily and take it over. So, in other words, what Tim Cornell argued was that the Etruscans essentially bypassed Rome and did not politically dominate Rome, they culturally influenced it. So what we're talking about then, in his view, is not so much an Etruscan empire or an extended Etruscan kingdom and control of central Italy, but rather a sphere of influence, a sphere of cultural and undoubtedly political influence as well. It was not a centralized state or empire, but rather just one of kind of cultural influence. Now, whether or not Tim Cornell's view is true, I know that when I spoke with Larissa Bonfante about this many years ago, she did not accept it, actually. She does believe in the idea of the Etruscan dominance of Rome. So again, another good example of hotly debated matter of early, among ancient Roman history that, but it is part of the interest, one of the interesting aspects of the subject, that there is such a debate and about such a fundamental issue. And it is fully illustrative of what we talked about in my introductory remarks today, the sorts of things that people argue about in ancient history. Now, so the Etruscans were very thoroughly absorbed by the Romans. This is one of the reasons they were initially considered to be so mysterious. Drawing the line between Etruscan and Roman in so many fields has proven to be very difficult. The Romans tended to look at their own culture and later on and say, well, what is this? Why do we do this strange thing? Why do we wear these togas? Or why do we do that? Oh, that's because the Etruscans did that. Or why do we sit in this kind of chair? Well, that's because the Etruscans did it. And all sorts of things. One of the major things, actually, was the divination of the future by the flight of birds. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this, that the Romans, like all ancient Mediterranean cultures, had a great occupation with portents and omens and signs of the gods. And the Etruscans were very, very big into this. And the Romans basically absorbed all of that weird stuff. So into Roman religion. And the Romans took it extremely seriously. Before any major event, before a meeting of the Senate, before a marriage, before a battle, you always had to get the will of the gods. And the way you would do that, there were different methods. One of them was by the flight of birds, though. A priest would stand out there and he would have a kind of magical staff called a lituus that he would demarcate different quadrants of the sky, say prayers, of course, in the Etruscan language. Even the Romans later on, they would actually, all of their priests would be trained in learning the Etruscan lore, Etruscan language, even though it was so different from Latin. Not unlike, I guess, in some ways, using liturgical languages like Latin, say, in the Catholic Church. And these Roman priests would wait for certain birds to fly, and a certain type of bird flew in from a different direction, a certain direction. It meant one thing or another, and you had to be trained, of course, in how to read all of these things. There was also augury by looking at the guts of animals, sacrificial animals. If the liver had spots in a particular place, that meant you had to pray to certain gods. All sorts of different stuff. And the Romans picked all that up. They absorbed that totally into their own culture. And as I say, all of these other aspects, the tomb paintings, the fasces, the toga, all of these were huge influences upon the Romans later on. Okay. Now, so if we put it all together, let's go back to our little map here. Pre-Roman Italy is kind of a patchwork, then a quilt of various cultures with a great variety of languages, some with foreigners, Greeks in the south, Celts in the north, and the whole place, while not waiting for Rome, certainly was going to experience Rome in no short order in the centuries to come. And now, my friends, I would like to move on to the last portion of our talk for today, the foundation of Rome, if you are following along with the notes, as I hope you are. We're now going to take a look at that. We're going to look at the archaeological evidence for the earliest history of the site of Rome and its immediate context, and we will end with a brief examination of one of the themes that we have been talking about throughout this whole part this morning, and that is the issue of the limits of archaeological evidence as illustrated by a single question: under what circumstances and when was Rome founded? Because we have literary evidence, we have lots of legends that were written down from the Romans themselves, but we do have archaeological evidence as well. And the question really has to be, can those two things be reconciled with one another? And if not, what are the contradictions? All right. Well, later Romans preserved two tales about the origin of their people and their city. Both are well known to most people. One of them surrounds the twins Romulus and Remus. The other surrounds the Trojan hero Aeneas. I'll deal with each of them in sequence. The story about Romulus and Remus is entertaining, so I'll just tell it. Okay, it is preserved in numerous versions by the Romans themselves, and it is typical in legendary or mythical tales that there are a variety of versions of them floating around in the ancient world. So the version that I'm going to give to you is that preserved by one of our major sources that I'm going to be referring to throughout this course, Titus Livius, or as he's known in English simply as Livy, one of our best extant sources for the earliest periods of Roman history. Livy wrote a vast history of Rome in 142 books at the time of the Emperor Augustus, so around the turn of the millennium. He started writing probably around like 30 BC onwards. He took him about 40 years to complete this project, but a perfect example of how so few of our sources, literary sources, have survived. Of those 142 books, 35 books of Livy's history have survived, including the first 5, which deal with the very earliest periods of Roman history. They are an invaluable source, at least for what later Romans thought about the earliest phases of their own history. A lot of the early stuff, though, is legendary. So what I want to tell you now is Livy's version of this story of Romulus and Remus, but there are other variants out there, and you may have heard some details that diverge from what I'm going to say. But don't worry if you have. The story is, it's good no matter what version you read. So the story begins in Alba Longa, which is a town in the plain of Latium, where the king Numitor finds himself deposed by his wicked brother Amulius. The wicked, villainous Amulius commences murdering the children of his brother, but he spares the niece, a woman named Rhea Silvia, making her instead a Vestal Virgin, obviously a calculated move, since as a Vestal Virgin, that is one of the women who tended the sacred flame of Vesta, and who could not get married, by virtue of that fact, she could never have royal children, no grandsons of Numitor to arise and avenge his usurpation. Rather embarrassingly, though, Rhea finds herself pregnant, and naturally, this is laid at the feet of a god, none other than the god Mars, the god of war. Not only does she have a son, she actually has twins, Romulus and Remus. Now, Amulius, the new king, who has deposed his brother Numitor, is horrified, and he imprisons Rhea and orders the boys drowned. Now, you would think, okay, that would be pretty easy to do, although terrible. But he devises a kind of James Bond-like way of killing the boys, that takes up so much time that provides plenty of chances to get away. So rather than just killing the children outright, they are placed in a little basket and sent down the river. Lo and behold, the basket doesn't sink. It gets washed up on the shores of the river Tiber, where the children are discovered by a she-wolf, which you see in front of you, and suckled, kept alive, until a shepherd, Faustus, happens to come by, and he brings the children home and raises them to adulthood. As young men, Romulus and Remus perform all sorts of daring do. They go around being brigands, basically, on brigands. They live a sort of Robin Hood-like lifestyle, robbing from the robbers. But rather than distributing the loot to the poor, they just keep it for themselves and distribute it amongst their friends. Eventually, though, this sort of behavior draws the attention of the king, and Remus is captured and brought forth before Amulius as a brigand. Then, for some reason in the story, he is kicked out from Amulius's presence and sent over to Numitor, who appears to have been living in kind of like house arrest in the countryside in relative obscurity. Exactly why he is sent there, as I say, is not made clear, but he is sent over there. And then a very important moment happens. Remus is standing there before Numitor, and it becomes clear to everyone that this is no brigand. A brigand doesn't have that fine stature, that noble profile and character. And the shepherd who is on hand says, well, you know, I've always suspected that there was that she-wolf, and I always thought there was something special about these two boys. And then, of course, Numitor asks, well, how long ago was that? And then shepherd says, oh, so-and-so. Well, my goodness, everything falls into place, and it becomes clear that Romulus and Remus are the very grandsons of Numitor. They organize a coup and depose Amulius and kill him for good measure, and reinstall Numitor as the king of Alba Longa. So far, the whole story revolves around this internal politics of Alba Longa. But here's where a rather tenuous link comes into play. It suddenly grabs the twins that they feel the urge to go and found a new city, a new settlement somewhere. So they truck along to where the basket was washed ashore on the River Tiber, and it just happens to be below the slopes of a hill called the Palatine Hill, which is the center of modern-day Rome, you see. And there they found their settlement. And the tale ends in tragedy, however, because Romulus and Remus quarrel over the new settlement. The two most common reasons given for the quarrel in the ancient sources are that they quarreled over the naming of the settlement. Romulus wanted it named after himself. Remus, of course, wanted it named after himself. Presumably, if Remus had won, we would be speaking not about the great city of Rome, but that of Rheims on the River Tiber. Romulus won the argument, and he did so in a fashion that has proven to be most effective throughout history. He killed his brother. There is another source, another version of the story that says that Remus mocked the walls of the town by jumping over them and showing how small they were. And this irritated Romulus so much that he, in a fit of rage, he killed his brother. But either way, the upshot was the same. Romulus then stood alone as the founder of this new settlement called Rome and became its first king. There we have the Romulus and Remus story, immortalized in all kinds of famous images, including this statue, this wonderful Capitoline bronze wolf statue that can be seen in the Capitoline Museum in Rome to this day. It is an Etruscan statue of the wolf, which really attests to the antiquity of the tale. The statue dates to about 600 BC. So it's very, very old, although I will add immediately that the two little babies that you see in this picture are not a feature of the original statue. They were added during the Renaissance period. But the idea that the wolf stands as an image of Rome goes back to very, very ancient dates. And if you go to Rome, you will see this image literally on, like, you know, napkins and the corner of buildings, and I mean it's just everywhere over the, you know, all over the place, shopping bags and stuff. Now, let's take a look at this tale. Obviously, anyone who has ever read folklore would see that it has all, this story has all the hallmarks of, you know, legend and indigenous folklore to it. You find these sort of things repeated again and again in all sorts of cultures around the globe, not just in the Mediterranean. We have the special children, royal children, who were denied their birthright. There is an attempt to kill those children by some kind of villainous ruler. The children miraculously escape and end up being raised by animals or people of lowly birth. Eventually, their true character shines through, and they come back into the story to seize control of their destinies and undo the wrong that was done them and their families in the past. You know, whether you call that whether you think of, I don't know, Oedipus Rex or Luke Skywalker, it's all kind of basically the same myth, isn't it? And and if you've ever read looked at Joseph Campbell, the famous mythicist, who's got wonderful lectures on YouTube, all of these stories, images, and motifs are found repeatedly in folklore from Africa to Polynesia in various degrees. As a result, most historians agree that this is an original story of the Romans. This goes back to a very, very early date, but that it basically has no real historical value. Okay, that is basically the upshot. It is probably the oldest story that they had, but it probably has no real historical validity. Now, the other legend that the Romans preserved about their past comes from a different source. It focuses on the Trojan War. Those of you that are familiar with Greek myth will be aware that the Trojan War is one of those formative events in the Greek communal memory. It is the focus of the two great national epics of the Greeks, the Iliad and the Odyssey. It is the focus, the source of many of the Greeks' values, the source of some of the greatest stories of Greek legend, Helen of Troy, the Trojan horse, Achilles, and all that great stuff. It is therefore very much a Greek story. And that makes it odd, doesn't it? That this other Roman foundation legend derives not from a Roman source, but ultimately from a Greek source. Because according to this legend, Aeneas, who was a Trojan, the last survivor of Troy, came after the destruction of the city, when it was captured by the Greeks through the Trojan horse. He fled his burning city, carrying his father, as you see here, on his shoulders, leading his son by his hand. You see little Ascanius scampering at his feet there. And he takes off in a boat, sails across the Mediterranean, undergoing all sorts of wonderful adventures before settling on the coast of Latium and founding this city of Lavinium on the coast of the plain of Latium in Italy. He also fights various local kings and makes alliances with some kings. The whole legend gets elaborated into what is probably the greatest monument of Latin literature ever, the Aeneid of Virgil, which I teach in English and Latin every year. But even with that, I still bring it with me when I go on vacation. That is my beach reading. The Aeneid is just one of the most wonderful pieces of literature ever written. And you should definitely read it before you graduate college. But anyway, the point though is that this is clearly, obviously, a very Greek legend. This is clearly a Roman origin story that is attempting to tie in with Greek culture. For the longest time, it was believed it could only have come into popular appeal among the Romans after they were exposed to Greek culture, when they were trying to emulate Greek culture, probably in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. But as we have seen, the Greeks had been present in Italy from at least 800 BC, and the Romans, who were familiar with the Etruscans, they were their neighbors after all, would have been well familiar with Greek culture long before the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. Therefore, in all likelihood, this story of Aeneas goes back much earlier than the Roman exposure to Greek culture once they started conquering the Greeks in the 3rd century. And it probably doesn't go back as far as Romulus and Remus as that legend, but certainly it not as recently as the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. In fact, recent archaeological discoveries at the site of Lavinium, that is the town supposedly founded by Aeneas, suggest that Aeneas was being worshipped there as a demigod as early as the 4th century BC. It certainly seems to be the case that this legend is older, therefore, than many previously assumed. There is a problem, though, and the problem is, how do you unite these two stories? If Aeneas is supposedly like kind of the founder, and Romulus and Remus are the founders, well, that's a big problem, because some people obviously had the vague notion that Romulus and Remus were somehow connected with Aeneas. There was this idea that they were somehow the descendants of Aeneas. So how do you reconcile these two things? The Romans had already basically arbitrarily decided that the date for the foundation of Rome was the year 753. That's the traditional founding date of Rome, 753 BC. Okay, the traditional the fall of Troy took place in 1184 BC, so in the 12th century BC. Okay, so that's 400 years earlier. Unless Romulus and Remus or Aeneas were exceptionally long-lived, therefore they could not be grandsons or anything like that. The solution, therefore, was reached at some stage, we're not quite sure, but certainly by Livy's day, that made the relationship between Aeneas and Romulus more distant. Aeneas, in the 12th century, after his wanderings from Troy, founds the city of Lavinium. His son Ascanius, who's also known as Iulus, founds the city of Alba Longa, and many hundreds of years later, from the kings of Alba Longa, as we have seen from Romulus and Remus, I should say, as we have seen from the legend, Romulus and Remus emerge as the descendants. So it's like Aeneas brings in basically the Roman bloodline. And then from that bloodline, Romulus and Remus emerge, and then Romulus founds the city that the Roman people were to flourish in. So that's basically how they reconcile these two traditions. Now, these are great tales, very entertaining. Let's try to address the issue of historicity. How historical are they? Archaeological evidence suggests a somewhat different picture from the origins of Rome. The site of Rome itself is very advantageous. It is located on a series of hills and spurs of hills overlooking a natural ford in the river Tiber, where there is an island, Tiberino. It is the only island in the stream of the Tiber, actually, at least that is close to the sea. So it is a natural place to ford the river. The evidence would suggest, therefore, that this spot, being very easily defensible, allowing the people who occupied it to control traffic that goes across the river in the north-south axis, and to control traffic that goes inland and upstream, downstream, from the inland regions to the sea. It was all very advantageous, and this is going to give the people who occupy this site a strong advantage over their neighbors. So as a result, it was an attractive place to settle naturally. It seems that the first signs of human settlement from the archaeological evidence date to a much, much, much older period of time than 753. In fact, as early maybe as the Bronze Age, 1500 BC. They are not signs of permanent settlement, but of human presence. There are some burials and some pottery shards and so forth. But around 1000 BC, the first burials show up, and the presence of burials plus also other things there. Pottery shards, people could have just dropped them as they walked through that area, but burials mean people were living there. And so that is a sign of permanent settlement. So we can date that to about 1000 BC. And just to summarize the archaeological evidence, because it's very complicated, it seems to be that originally the settlements on the hills were independent villages, okay? The nature of these villages, Rome is situated on 7 hills, famously. There actually are more hills, but the number 7 is just one of those numbers, so they went by 7. The nature of those villages and the people who occupy them, their interrelationships among each other and the relationships with their neighbors are all things that we cannot reconstruct from the archaeological evidence. It does seem to be, though, that each settlement had its own defensive perimeter and was very much its own place. But at some stage, at some early stage, dates are really impossible at this early point. At some early stage, though, separately, these villages coalesced into a single community. This is the process for which we have parallels in the Greek sphere, in Greek history. It goes, archaeologists and historians refer to it by a rather odd sounding term called synoikism. Synoikism simply means coming together, the coming together into a community. So you have these kind of clans living disparately on separate hills, but then before you know it, they realize they need to kind of clean out the gene pool, and so they intermarry with one another, and they become linked, therefore, and this sort of, and they become part of one large community. This is the process that is found throughout archaic communities in Greece at about this time. It is usually the result of a localized rise in population that makes villages and communities in proximity to each other coalesce into a single entity. Now, in the 1930s, spectacular finds were made on the Palatine Hill. Excavations there revealed holes. Well, what is so spectacular about holes, you'll ask? They were post holes carved into the rock of one of the outcrops from the Palatine Hill. These post holes conform to a model of an early wooden hut into which these posts would have been placed. The hut is made from the posts being placed into the ground, from the walls built around the posts, and the roof put over the top of the posts. From the burials in Latium, we can tell that these huts are what they look like. And these ancient peoples of Latium, interestingly enough, buried their dead. They cremated them and then buried the ashes inside of urns shaped like these huts. So this is what those huts would have looked like. It's too, if we were meeting in person in Fordham, I would walk us over at the end of class to the wonderful antiquities collection that the Fordham has in its library. And we have a couple of these from the 700s BC, from very, very early on in Roman history. But you'll have to just take a look. This is what they look like, okay, hut urns. But the point is that they found holes in the 1930s on the Palatine Hill. And what we can gather from this is that we seem to have found evidence of the first settlement in Rome. Okay, so you have people burying their dead in places that look like what they lived like. You find archaeological evidence of the holes that were, they would put, you see like these posts that are going up, these kind of, these beams that are there. Those would go all the way down into the ground, and the softer materials would be kind of draped around them. So this is what archaeologists, at least in the 1930s, felt. Now, of course, though, we need to remind ourselves who was ruling Italy in the 1930s, and why is it that he, Mussolini, might have wanted to find evidence of the earliest settlement in Rome. If you ever have visited Italy and you go around to some of the old Roman sites, you'll know that Mussolini was very, very much at pains to try to link modern day Italy with ancient Rome. Okay, he was constantly putting up monuments in Latin and trying to show this connection between modern Italians and the ancient Romans, and trying to fuse this notion. So the fact that they might have found this thing, and they went even further. They dated these huts on the Palatine Hill to about 750 BC. Oh, well, if you remember that the legends say that Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus in 753 BC, well, the story of Romulus and Remus seems to have been confirmed by finding the settlement of huts on the Palatine Hill. And then we also find, interesting enough, in ancient Britain sources, later sources, that the Romans themselves maintained on the Palatine a reed and stick hut, which they call the hut of Romulus, as kind of like a sort of shrine or something like that from a much later period. I see that there is a chat. Let me read that. And well, so I'm giving you all the different details so that you can kind of see all the pictures, all the different parts of the puzzle. One last thing, we are also told by an ancient source, in this case a man with the wonderful name of Dionysius of Halicarnassus, that if ever that hut collapsed or was damaged, it would always be rebuilt with the same types of materials that it had been originally built with. And so you put it all together, and the archaeologists of the time thought, well, here you go, we have the hut of Romulus. Now, so who was it that asked that question? As Hunter asked, do we? Is it true? Well, the archaeological evidence gives us, I think, a different picture of how Rome came about than the legend. You see, what we have is not a picture of an instantaneous or immediate settlement, as the legends would have us believe. Right? Romulus decides to go out and found a town, and goes out and finds it on virgin soil. Rather, the archaeology paints a picture of gradual settlement over a period of hundreds of years. Where originally this area may have been used as a trading post, then gradually attracting settlement. Those settlements being separate villages on different hills. Ultimately, they eventually coalesced into something, at some unknown period, into a single community. It is a gradual evolutionary process rather than a single foundation of an event as a town, as the legend of Romulus would have us believe. So I think it is more important to appreciate that the problem with the archaeology versus the legendary evidence goes deeper than even this. It goes to the very soul and heart of the limits of our ancient material. To put a finer point upon it, we have on the one hand wonderful stories, entertaining stories, And on the other hand, we have post holes, holes in the ground, burial urns, signs of settlement. In some ways, the twain cannot meet here. And even the fact that Aeneas was worshipped at Lavinium in the 4th century, that does not confirm the Aeneas legend. It simply tells us that people in Lavinium in the 4th century BC worshipped Aeneas. It was supposed to have been, what did I say, 700 years earlier that he came. So, I'm sorry, by the 4th century, it would have been 800 years earlier. So just because we have simple looking huts on the Palatine Hill that appear to date to the 8th century BC does not tell us that Romulus and Remus were ever sent in a basket down the river, Tiber. And certainly that they were suckled by a she-wolf, or even that they founded the city. In other words, archaeology cannot confirm those legends. It cannot confirm them. In fact, more recent studies of the huts on the Palatine Hill show that their earliest phases may go back even to that period of around 1000 BC themselves, maybe 900. So even the date of them coinciding with the date of the stories of Romulus and Remus, that 753 number, even that can be called into question too. Okay, so I would say, Hunter, the story is not true. I'm sorry, but at the same time, though, to a certain degree, asking archaeology to confirm this or that legend is not only unfair to the archaeology, it's also unfair to the legend. After all, the function of these stories is not so much for the ancients themselves to give an accurate historical account of their past, but it is rather to give them a shared sense of communal belonging, of origin, through which they could all say, we are all nati, or sons of Romulus. You see, the very word nation in Latin is natio, nationis, comes from the word for sons, for the descendants, that everyone is kind of part of this one ethnic project in a sense, or even if it's not ethnic, you can be a son, of course, in a non-ethnic sense, right? In a non-biological sense, you can be a son by adoption, a child by adoption. And in fact, right from the very beginning, one of the other aspects of the Romulus legend is that he invited every brigand and every thief and criminal that didn't have a place to live into his city. It kind of is like, give me your poor, you're hungry, or you're, whatever the rest of that line goes on the Statue of Liberty. He brought over everybody that were not actually parts of, ethnically belonging to a certain, group, but they were anybody who wanted to could come there. And, the connections to America in that regard are really palpable. So, this is, I think, the function of the myth for the ancients themselves. These stories were colorful stories of their past that gave them a shared sense of belonging, a shared sense of communal history. And I'll just point out, because I know we have to call it a day, that while the archaeology evidence cannot confirm legendary evidence, it also doesn't really disprove it. For instance, if we go back to the Aeneas and Romulus and Remus thing, we have Aeneas found in Lavinium, supposedly around the 12th century BC, sometime after the Trojan War, given his wanderings. And then we have Aeneas' son Ascanius found in Alba Longa at some stage after that, 30, 40, 50 years later. Then we have Romulus and Remus 400 years after that, found in the site of Rome. So archaeology can go to these sites and examine the archaeological record at all these sites. And it is quite clear that Lavinium and Alba Longa are not markedly older than Rome. Okay, so that is actually, those stories cannot be made to jive with the archaeological evidence at all. There is no evidence that Alba Longa was 400 years older than the site of Rome. In fact, it looks like it was almost from the same time period. The same kind of stuff going on in Rome went on in Alba Longa. So as a result, it seems most likely that these stories were, in their current form, cultural constructions of the later Romans to explain their origins. The historical truth was really of little interest to the Romans themselves. They simply believed in these stories as being valuable tools to explain their ancient past, and we should approach them in the same way. Okay, so looking ahead at the period that is known as the regal period, which we will learn about tomorrow, the period of the kings initiated by Romulus. We can say that the sources for Roman history for this early period are very dubious indeed. The written evidence that we have from Livy, who was our main source, yes, he does have sources that were available to him that are no longer available to us. But he is writing a period of history that is as remote to him as the Middle Ages are to us. He is getting his stuff from the family legends preserved within the major noble aristocratic houses of Rome and from shared communal memory. Many of the stories of the kings, as we will see in more detail in the next lecture, are of the same legendary character. They're delightful and they're very interesting. The individual reigns of each of these 7 kings of Rome, and of course, there's that number 7 again, right? They have a particular character to them that reflects the legendary nature of the evidence. And to look even further ahead, I can say that the hard evidence for Roman history only really gets started really good in the period around the First Punic War in 264 BC. For the first 500 odd years of Roman history, our evidence is very patchy indeed. We have archaeology, but the literary material is patchy and dubious. As a result, the debates among modern scholars about many of the issues we are going to be discussing over the next, really tomorrow and the next few lectures really, are very intense. These debates are very intense because the interpretations, because the evidence is so patchy, can be much more divergent than they are for the later period. And with that, my friends, I think we're going to call it a day, and I will see you all tomorrow.